A lone soldier, wounded, outnumbered, stands atop a burning tank destroyer. The air is thick with smoke. Gunfire echoes all around him. His unit is gone. He is alone, but he does not surrender. With a .50 caliber machine gun in his hands, he fights not as one man, but as an entire army. He fires round after round, holding off hundreds of German soldiers. The enemy advances, yet he does not retreat. Who was this man? And how did he become America's greatest war hero? His name was Audie Murphy. But his journey to becoming a legend was full of pain, struggle, and relentless courage. Before he became the most decorated soldier of World War II, he was just a poor Texas boy, haunted by war before he even stepped onto the battlefield. This is the story of Audie Murphy, soldier who became a one-man army. It was a world of poverty, dust, and struggle. Life wasn't just hard, it was survival. For Audie Murphy, childhood was not filled with games or laughter. It was filled with hunger, work, and sacrifice. He was one of 12 children. His family barely had enough food to eat. They lived in a rundown shack, where every meal was uncertain. Some days, there was nothing at all. Then, it got worse. His father, a man who was supposed to protect and provide, simply walked away. One day, he left and never came back. Audie Murphy was just a child, but in that moment, he became a man. With his father gone, the weight of the world fell on his young shoulders. There was no time for school, no time for childhood. He had a family to keep alive. At just 10 years old, he was already working long hours in the cotton fields under the brutal Texas sun. The work was backbreaking, but it still wasn't enough to put food on the table. That's when he picked up a rifle. Hunting wasn't a sport. It was a necessity. One shot, one kill. No second chances. If he missed, his family didn't eat, so he never missed. Day after day, he stalked through the fields and forests, learning how to move silently, how to stay patient, how to wait for the perfect shot. Without realizing it, he was preparing for something much bigger. But no amount of hardship could prepare him for what was coming next. The 7th of December, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor. America was at war. Audie Murphy didn't hesitate. He didn't think twice. He was going to fight. He was going to serve his country. But there was one problem. He was only 16, too young to enlist, too small, too weak. The recruiters took one look at him and shook their heads. Rejected. But Audie Murphy never took no for an answer. 1 year later, he tried again. First, he walked into a Navy recruitment office. They turned him down, said he didn't have the size or strength. Then he went to the Marines, the toughest, meanest fighters in the world. Maybe they would take him. They took one look at him and laughed him out the door. But Audie Murphy refused to give up. He was determined. He had no other life to go back to, no home worth staying for, no future outside of war. He walked into an army recruiting office, determined to enlist. This time, he lied about his age. He told them he was 18, and this time, they said yes. Audie Murphy was finally a soldier. But he had no idea what awaited him. The war would take him to battlefields across Europe. It would push him to his limits. It would take everything from him and turn him into something else. A warrior. War. The moment Audie Murphy had been waiting for. But nothing could prepare him for what he was about to face. After months of brutal training, he was finally deployed. First to North Africa, then to the Italian front in 1943. The moment he stepped onto the battlefield, he realized this was not a game. This was not hunting rabbits in the Texas woods. This was something else entirely. It started in Sicily, a rocky, unforgiving land. The heat was unbearable. The enemy was relentless. Murphy's unit moved cautiously through the hills, rifles ready. Then, gunfire, explosions, chaos. His first battle had begun. Bullets ripped through the air. Soldiers screamed. The enemy was hidden, dug into the hills, raining down machine gun fire. Murphy dove for cover. His hands shook. His heart pounded. This was it. His first real fight. Then something changed. Instinct took over. He aimed, fired. Enemy soldiers dropped one by one. He moved quickly, staying low, advancing under heavy fire. While others hesitated, he pushed forward. He didn't just survive the battle, he stood out. The war was already shaping him, turning him into something else. But that was just the beginning. Italy, 1944. The Battle of Anzio. Anzio was supposed to be an easy victory. It wasn't. It turned into a nightmare, a bloodbath. The Germans fought with everything they had. Artillery shells rained down. Men were blown apart. The beach was littered with bodies. The air smelled of smoke, sweat, and death. Murphy watched friends die, one after another. Good men, brave men, some of them barely older than boys. But something inside him refused to break. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He fought harder. Under relentless enemy fire, Murphy and his unit held the line. For days, for weeks, they endured wave after wave of attacks. Sleep was a luxury. Food was scarce. The only thing that mattered was survival. And Audie Murphy didn't just survive, thrived. By the time the battle ended, his commanders had taken notice. He wasn't just another soldier, he was something more. He was fearless, relentless, unstoppable. The war was changing him. It was forging him into a warrior. And soon, the world would see what he was truly capable of. War had already changed Audie Murphy. He had fought, he had survived, he had lost friends, but what was coming next would turn him into a legend. The Battle of Holtzwihr. The 26th of January 1945. The snow-covered fields of Holtzwihr, France. A bitterly cold winter morning. The air was silent. But Murphy knew what was coming. He could feel it. He and his men were positioned along the edge of a forest. Their mission? Hold the line. But they were badly outnumbered. The Germans were coming, hundreds of them. Soldiers, machine gunners, mortar teams, and worst of all, tanks. They had nowhere to run, no reinforcements, just 35 men against an entire battalion. If they failed, the German advance would continue. The war wouldn't wait. Then, the attack began. German artillery rained down. Shells exploded all around them. The ground shook, trees splintered, smoke and fire filled the air. Then, the tanks appeared. Massive, steel monsters rolling forward with deafening roars. Behind them, waves of enemy soldiers, a wall of destruction heading straight for Murphy's position. The first tank fired. An explosion tore through the American lines. Men were thrown into the air. Screams echoed through the smoke. Murphy's unit was being wiped out. His commander had no choice. He gave the order to retreat. But Murphy didn't move. Instead, he ran toward the burning wreckage of an M10 tank destroyer. The vehicle had been hit. It was on fire. Ammunition inside was cooking off, exploding randomly. And that's when he did the unthinkable. He climbed on top of it, right in the open, completely exposed. Just him, standing on a burning tank, facing an entire German battalion alone. With his hands, he grabbed the .50 caliber machine gun mounted on the tank. A weapon meant for vehicle combat. A weapon designed to destroy enemy armor. And he turned it on the advancing German soldiers. Then he opened fire. The first wave of enemy infantry never stood a chance. Bullets ripped through them. Bodies dropped into the snow. The German advance faltered. They weren't expecting this. One man alone, refusing to fall back. Murphy kept firing. He took down machine gunners. He shattered mortar teams. He cut down entire squads before they even had a chance to react. The Germans panicked. The attack should have been over. The Americans should have been dead. But here was one man, standing against an entire army, and he was winning. But Murphy wasn't just shooting. He was thinking. With one hand on the machine gun, he grabbed a radio with the other. He called in an artillery strike on his own position. This is Murphy. Fire for effect. Audi, get out of there. Negative. Light them up. Seconds later, American artillery began to rain down. Shells exploded all around him. The battlefield turned into hell itself. Murphy didn't stop shooting. He fought and fought for over an hour. Then, silence. Smoke covered the battlefield. The German attack had collapsed. Those who survived had retreated. Murphy had won. He climbed down from the burning tank, covered in blood, some of it his, most of it not. His uniform was torn. His body was exhausted. But he was still standing. He had single-handedly held off 250 German soldiers and 6 tanks. One man against an entire army. And he won. But that wasn't his only moment of greatness. Battle after battle, Audie Murphy proved himself. At the Battle of Montélimar, he led a small squad in an ambush against a much larger German force. He personally destroyed 2 enemy machine gun nests, saving his unit from being overrun. During the Battle of Lomé, he crawled within yards of an enemy sniper, took aim, and eliminated him before the sniper could pull the trigger. In another battle, he jumped into an enemy foxhole, fought in brutal hand-to-hand combat, and emerged victorious. Everywhere he went, he turned the tide of battle. He wasn't just surviving, he was dominating. By the time the war ended, Audie Murphy had earned every major medal for valor that the US military could award. Medal of Honor, Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star, twice, Bronze Star, twice, Legion of Merit, Purple Heart, 3 times, and over 30 more decorations. He became the most decorated US soldier of World War II. He became the most decorated US soldier of World War II. But with every victory, there was a cost. Murphy wasn't just fighting the enemy, he was fighting exhaustion, fear, and the weight of losing his brothers in arms. He had seen things no man should ever see. He had done things no man should ever have to do. And though the war was ending, Audie Murphy's battle was far from over. The war was over. The world celebrated. Parades filled the streets. Flags waved. Soldiers returned home to cheers and applause. But for Audie Murphy, the war never truly ended. He stepped off the ship, a national hero. The most decorated soldier of World War II. Reporters surrounded him. Cameras flashed. Everyone wanted to shake his hand. Everyone wanted to hear his story. But inside, Murphy felt nothing. He had survived battlefields soaked in blood. He had held dying friends in his arms. He had killed more men than he could count. Now, standing in the safety of his homeland, surrounded by smiling faces, he felt like he didn't belong. The war had taken something from him, something he could never get back. He tried to return to a normal life. But what was normal for a man who had spent years in the trenches, where every second could be his last? At night, he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back in battle. The screams, the gunfire, the smell of burning flesh. It never left him. The doctors had a name for it: combat fatigue. Today, we call it PTSD. But back then, no one understood it. No one talked about it. He was expected to move on, to be the hero America needed him to be. But inside, he was still fighting. He couldn't sit in crowded rooms. Loud noises made his heart race. Sudden movements made him reach for a weapon that wasn't there. He was restless, angry, trapped in a war that only he could see. His family saw the change. The once quiet, determined young man was now on edge, quick-tempered, unpredictable. He avoided people. He drank to quiet the nightmares. Nothing helped. The war still lived inside him. But Murphy wasn't the type to give up. He needed a purpose, a mission, and he found it in Hollywood. Movie producers saw him as a real-life action hero. They offered him roles in war films. It made sense. He had lived the stories they wanted to tell. He starred in dozens of movies, played cowboys, soldiers, tough men who didn't back down. He even played himself in the film adaptation of his autobiography, To Hell and Back. The movie became a massive success, the highest grossing war film of its time. Audiences loved him. Studios wanted more. But behind the cameras, the real Audie Murphy was still struggling. He carried a gun everywhere he went, not for fame, not for show, but because he still felt like he was in danger. Sleep was rare. Peace was impossible. The fame didn't change the fact that he was still fighting his demons. He had money, success, admiration, but what he really wanted was something he could never have, a way to forget. So he found another mission. If he couldn't silence his own nightmares, maybe he could help others who suffered like he did. He started speaking about PTSD long before it was recognized as a real condition. He testified before Congress, urging them to take care of veterans who returned home broken. The war doesn't end when a soldier comes home, he said. For many of us, it never ends at all. He fought to get better care for veterans. He spoke about the invisible wounds of war. He tried to make the world understand what men like him went through. It was a battle that few recognized, but he fought it anyway. But the war inside him never fully ended, and in the years to come, it would take its toll. Audie Murphy's battle was far from over. Though the war had ended, his personal fight against the trauma, the pain, and the demons of the past was just beginning to take its toll. By 1971, Audie Murphy had built a life that many would envy: fame, wealth, and a legacy as a national hero. But on the inside, the scars of war were deep and unhealed. PTSD had cast a shadow over every part of his existence. For years, he had struggled with insomnia, anxiety, and survivor's guilt. He drank to numb the pain. He fought with loved ones. He fought with himself. But despite all of it, he refused to surrender. Murphy was no stranger to the battlefield. But it wasn't the enemy that would take him down. It wasn't the war that would claim his life. It was something far more tragic. On May 28, 1971, Audie Murphy was flying to a business meeting in Catawba, Virginia. He was 45 years old. The plane he was traveling in, a twin-engine Aero Commander, was caught in a violent storm. The pilot attempted to navigate the treacherous weather, but tragically lost control. The plane crashed into Brush Mountain near Catawba, Virginia. All 6 passengers aboard were killed instantly. When the news broke, the nation mourned. Audie Murphy, the most decorated soldier in US history, was gone. His death came far too soon for a man who had already lived a lifetime of heroism, both on the battlefield and off. The man who had fought in the bloodiest corners of World War II, who had stood alone against an entire enemy battalion, now lay silent. Murphy was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, a fitting place for a man whose bravery had inspired an entire nation. His grave remains one of the most visited in the cemetery, a place where people from all walks of life come to pay their respects to the soldier who had become a living legend. Even in death, Audie Murphy continues to inspire. He is remembered not only for his bravery, but for his resilience. He is remembered as a man who faced horrors beyond imagination, yet still returned to fight for others, for his fellow soldiers, for those who couldn't speak of their struggles. Audie Murphy's life was more than just the story of a hero on the battlefield. It was the story of a man who fought the hardest battles within himself. A man who turned tragedy into strength, who turned his pain into purpose, who never gave up, no matter how many battles he had to fight. Audie Murphy was a hero on the battlefield, a soldier whose bravery turned him into a living legend. But the greatest battle of his life wasn't fought on the front lines of war. It was fought within himself. He returned from World War II, covered in medals, hailed as America's greatest war hero. But the trauma he carried never left him. His courage wasn't just about facing the enemy. It was about confronting his own demons and sharing his painful story, even when the world didn't understand. Audie Murphy wasn't just a warrior, he was a survivor. He fought for recognition of the invisible wounds that so many veterans carried. His battle with PTSD was one that so many others were facing but had no voice to speak up. But here's the real question. Was Audie Murphy's greatest achievement the courage he showed on the battlefield? Or was it his fight to raise awareness for the emotional scars of war long before PTSD was even a recognized term? We want to hear from you. What do you think was Audie Murphy's greatest legacy? His military heroism, or his dedication to helping veterans cope with the unseen wounds of war? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more legendary war stories, more tales of courage, pain, and resilience, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, join the conversation, and keep the stories alive. In the vast, unforgiving deserts of North Africa, a battle raged that would become the stuff of legend. Erwin Rommel, the man known to his enemies as the Desert Fox, was surrounded. His forces, trapped by the might of the Allied armies, faced certain defeat. Or so it seemed. But what if I told you that despite being encircled on all sides, Rommel not only survived, but triumphed? This is the story of a man who defied the odds, outsmarted his enemies, and changed the course of history. A story of a general whose name still echoes through the corridors of military strategy, and whose actions remain the subject of awe. Erwin Rommel, a commander with the heart of a lion, a tactician like no other, and a man who would not give up no matter the odds. On one fateful day, surrounded by overwhelming force, Rommel had no choice but to make a decision that would either end in defeat or cement his place in history forever. Stay with me as we uncover the incredible story of how Erwin Rommel was surrounded, but still won. Before Erwin Rommel became the Desert Fox, before his name was etched in the annals of military legend, he was just a young man from a modest background, destined for greatness. Born in 1891 in the small town of Heidenheim, Germany, Rommel's journey began not on the battlefield, but with a deep love for adventure and a desire to serve his country. Rommel's early life was far from glamorous. His family was not wealthy, and his father, a teacher, was strict, demanding excellence from his children. Rommel, however, had a different path in mind. While others in his family pursued academic careers, Erwin was drawn to the military. The discipline and structure of the army called to him, and at the age of 18, he entered the German Imperial Army as a cadet. It was here that Rommel would begin to form his identity as a soldier, sharp, calculated, and determined. His early years in the army were marked by quiet discipline, but his real rise to prominence came during World War I. Serving on the Western Front, Rommel proved himself time and again, earning the respect of his fellow soldiers and the admiration of his superiors. In one of his first major battles, the young officer distinguished himself through an audacious and highly successful raid that surprised the enemy. This was the moment when Rommel's tactical brilliance began to shine. His ability to think outside the box and inspire those around him quickly set him apart from others. Rommel's daring tactics were not without risk. He pushed his men to the edge, leading from the front, refusing to stay behind lines of safety. And it was this boldness that earned him the respect of his soldiers. He wasn't just a commander, he was their leader, the one who fought beside them, and they would follow him anywhere. By the end of World War I, Rommel had earned the prestigious Pour le Mérite, one of Germany's highest military honors. His reputation as a fierce, fearless leader was now firmly established. But little did Rommel know, his most famous battle sand, the ultimate test of his skill, were still many years away. His next chapter would take him far from the trenches of Europe to the scorching deserts of North Africa, where the world would come to know the man who could win, even when surrounded. The stage for Rommel's greatest challenge was set not in the fields of Europe, but in the barren, unforgiving deserts of North Africa. It was 1941, and the Allies were locked in a brutal struggle against Axis forces for control of the Mediterranean. The North African campaign had already seen its share of skirmishes, but now a new player was about to enter the fray. Erwin Rommel, a name that would soon send shockwaves through the British command, was called upon by Adolf Hitler to lead the Afrika Korps. His mission: to assist the Italian forces who had been struggling to hold their ground against the Allied powers. But what the Allies didn't know was that Rommel wasn't just another commander. He was a man who saw the battlefield differently, who saw opportunity where others saw defeat. Rommel's first steps in North Africa were marked by an almost immediate assault. He quickly proved his mettle, pushing the British forces back with an aggressive strategy that defied traditional expectations. His use of surprise, speed, and audacity became his trademark. He didn't play by the rules. He wasn't just fighting to hold ground. Rommel was fighting to win, and win quickly. His forces moved like lightning through the desert, taking advantage of the terrain, striking when and where his enemies least expected it. His enemies were caught off guard, bewildered by his unconventional tactics and bold moves. Rommel's success in the desert wasn't just about the battles he won, but about the way he inspired his troops. The men who fought under him were not just soldiers, they were followers, driven by his leadership, by his willingness to take risks right alongside them. His rise in North Africa was unstoppable. The British, under General Wavell, found themselves pushed back, outmaneuvered, and often defeated by a man they had underestimated. Rommel's name began to spread. He was more than just a German general, he was a force of nature, a master of desert warfare, and one of the most feared commanders in the world. But as Rommel's victories mounted, so did the stakes. The Allies were not going to sit back and let him continue his streak of success. Soon they would regroup, and the battle for North Africa would escalate to a level no one could have anticipated. As Rommel's victories in North Africa continued, the Allies knew they had to stop him. His rapid advances had shaken the very foundations of the British Empire's presence in the region. The stakes had never been higher, and the next battle would become one of the most crucial of the entire campaign. El Alamein, Egypt. A small town that would soon be written into history as the site of one of the most intense clashes of World War II. It was October 1942, and Rommel's forces had pushed deep into Egypt, threatening to capture the Suez Canal, a vital lifeline for the Allies. The British could not afford to lose this strategic location. The Axis powers, under Rommel's leadership, were now within striking distance of a decisive victory. But this time, Rommel was facing a new kind of enemy that had learned from its past mistakes. The British had regrouped, strengthened their defenses, and were now under the command of General Bernard Montgomery, a man determined to halt Rommel's advance. Rommel, stretched thin by months of continuous fighting, was facing supply shortages and exhausted troops. The desert, once his ally, had become his adversary. The heat, the sandstorms, and the constant threat of Allied air superiority weighed heavily on him. Yet, despite the mounting pressure, Rommel remained resolute. The Battle of El Alamein would be a test of everything Rommel stood for: his ability to outmaneuver, outthink, and outlast his opponents. As the battle unfolded, it became clear that this would not be a quick victory. The Allies had dug in, and Rommel's bold tactics were met with stiff resistance. In the brutal desert terrain, Rommel's Afrika Korps faced fierce counterattacks. The British forces were well prepared, their defenses formidable. The battle turned into a war of attrition, with neither side willing to give up an inch. Rommel pushed forward with everything he had, using his trademark speed and cunning, but Montgomery was no novice. The battle raged for days, and Rommel soon realized that victory would not come as easily as it had before. The balance of power was shifting. The Battle of El Alamein marked the first significant defeat for Rommel in North Africa. The British had successfully halted his advance, forcing the Afrika Korps into a retreat. It was a devastating blow, not just to Rommel's forces, but to his confidence. The Desert Fox had been bested, but the war was far from over. Despite the crushing defeat at El Alamein, Rommel's resilience was like no other. The Desert Fox had been momentarily halted, but the war was far from over. While his forces were forced to retreat, his spirit remained unbroken. Rommel understood that battles were won with more than just soldiers, and weapons they were won with willpower, boldness, and the ability to adapt. The next chapter in Rommel's North African campaign would come in the form of Tobruk, a strategically important port city in Libya. Tobruk was more than just a city. It was a fortress, a symbol of resistance. The British had turned it into one of the most heavily fortified locations in all of North Africa. Its capture would not only give Rommel access to crucial supplies and a stronger position for future operations, but it would also deal a crushing blow to the Allies' ability to hold the region. Rommel knew that capturing Tobruk would be no simple task. The British garrison there, under General Sir Neil Ritchie, was well entrenched, with miles of defensive positions and a powerful network of artillery. For months, the British had managed to hold the city, but Rommel was not a man to be deterred by such obstacles. In the wake of his defeat at El Alamein, Rommel had a singular goal: to demonstrate that he still had the ability to outmaneuver the Allies, to show that despite setbacks, his leadership and tactical brilliance could turn the tide once more. Rommel's plan for Tobruk was aggressive, and it relied on his signature approach to warfare: speed, surprise, and audacity. He moved his forces swiftly, executing a series of lightning-fast strikes aimed at testing the British defenses. Rommel did not believe in waiting for the perfect moment. He created that moment with each bold action. His men, though exhausted and worn from previous campaigns, followed him with unshakable loyalty. They knew that under Rommel's leadership, they would be given every opportunity to succeed. In battle, Rommel was always at the front, sharing the same risks and dangers as his men. His leadership style wasn't just about commanding from behind the line sit, was about leading by example, being there when it mattered most. Rommel's forces pushed forward with brutal precision. His troops would strike under the cover of night, launching attacks at key positions in British lines, often in places where they were least expected. These tactical strikes kept the British forces off balance, forcing them to constantly reassess their defenses. But the battle for Tobruk was not won easily. The Allies had prepared for this moment. Tobruk was no ordinary fortress. It was a well-stocked and well-defended stronghold, with deep trenches, anti-tank barriers, and heavy artillery positioned at critical points. The British were prepared to fight for every inch of ground. As the siege stretched on, Rommel faced more than just physical challenges. His forces were stretched thin, their supply lines increasingly disrupted, and the punishing desert heat was taking its toll. But Rommel was not one to give up. He understood that his men's morale was as important as any weapon in his arsenal. He spent hours on the front lines, encouraging his soldiers, directing fire, and often taking the same risks they did. The siege lasted for weeks, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Rommel's forces, slowly but surely, tightened their grip on the city, using their superior mobility to outflank and overwhelm the British defenses. The Axis forces had no heavy artillery like the British, but Rommel's cunning use of mobility, surprise, and psychological warfare wore the enemy down. Finally, after weeks of intense fighting, Rommel's forces succeeded. The British, unable to break the siege, were forced to retreat. Tobruk fell into German hands. For Rommel, it was a monumental victory, one that proved his resilience and his ability to recover from defeat. The city's capture was not just a strategic win, but a psychological one. Rommel's forces now controlled one of the most important locations in North Africa, but the victory came at a cost. His men were exhausted, and the war was far from over. The capture of Tobruk did not mean the end of the battle for North Africa. It merely set the stage for the next conflict. Rommel, having proven that even when surrounded by adversity, he could still find a way to win, now prepared for the next phase of his campaign. But the Allies were not defeated, yet they were already planning their response. The stage was set for the next great clash in the desert, one that would push Rommel and his forces to their limits. With the capture of Tobruk, Rommel's forces had secured a significant victory, but the war was far from won. The tide of battle in North Africa was about to change once again, and this time the stakes were higher than ever. As the Axis forces continued their push across North Africa, the Allies were regrouping, ready to strike back. In early 1943, the stage was set for one final, decisive showdown. The Battle of Tunisian all-out struggle for control of the region would become Rommel's final stand in North Africa. By now, Rommel was facing a dire situation. The long supply lines stretching from Europe to North Africa had become a significant burden. His forces were facing shortages of fuel, ammunition, and food. The relentless desert heat, combined with Allied air superiority, made every movement a challenge. Yet, Rommel refused to concede. Rommel's Afrika Korps had been pushed to the brink, but his tactical brilliance and ability to inspire his men had kept them fighting. However, even the Desert Fox knew that the days of rapid, overwhelming victories were behind him. The Allies were no longer caught off guard. They had learned from their past mistakes, and were now bringing their full might to bear. The Battle of Tunisia was a brutal, all-encompassing fight. The Germans and Italians found themselves entrenched in a war of attrition, trying to hold on to positions as the Allies advanced on all fronts. Rommel's forces faced fierce resistance from the combined might of the British, American, and Free French forces. The Allies had launched Operation Torch in November 1942, landing on the coast of North Africa, and were steadily pushing eastward. But Rommel wasn't done yet. Even in the face of mounting pressure, he remained a force to be reckoned with. His ability to outthink his opponents and adapt to the changing battlefield remained his greatest asset. Time and time again, he used his limited resources to deliver surprising counterattacks, keeping the Allies on edge. As the battle raged on, Rommel found himself in a precarious position. The Axis forces were surrounded, and the Allies' advantage in numbers, supply, and air power was undeniable. Rommel knew that the situation was becoming untenable. Yet, his commitment to his men, his desire to protect his soldiers, and his sense of duty kept him going. In March 1943, Rommel was reluctantly recalled to Germany by Hitler, who feared that his most famous general would be captured by the advancing Allied forces. It was a painful decision for Rommel, who had led his men through some of the most challenging battles in the desert. But his retreat signaled the beginning of the end for the Axis powers in North Africa. Rommel's withdrawal from the front lines marked the end of an era. His Afrika Korps, once feared for its lightning-fast attacks and bold strategies, was defeated. The Allies had gained the upper hand in North Africa, and the Axis powers were on the retreat. Rommel, despite his brilliance, could not turn the tide alone. Though Rommel left North Africa in disgrace, his legacy was already cemented. His ability to fight against overwhelming odds, his tactical genius, and his unwavering resolve had earned him the admiration of both allies and enemies alike. But as he returned to Germany, he knew that the war was far from over, and for him, a new, more dangerous chapter was just beginning. After his retreat from North Africa, Rommel returned to Germany, not as the victorious general he once was, but as a man whose reputation had been shaken. Despite his brilliant successes in the desert, the harsh reality of failure weighed heavily on him. Rommel had lost the battle for North Africa, and his career seemed uncertain. But what would come next for the Desert Fox would be both a test of his loyalty and his ability to navigate the treacherous politics of war. Back in Germany, Rommel was received with mixed emotions. His fame as a battlefield genius was still intact, but his failure in North Africa was a heavy stain on his record. Yet, despite the setback, Rommel remained a hero in the eyes of many. His tactics had been admired across the world, even by his enemies. There was a growing sense that Rommel might still play a pivotal role in Germany's future if he could find his place amidst the chaos of the Second World War. By 1943, Rommel was called upon again by Adolf Hitler, not to lead the war in North Africa, but to defend Europe itself from the advancing Allies. Rommel was tasked with overseeing the defense of France, preparing for the inevitable Allied invasion that seemed increasingly likely as the war turned in favor of the Allies. Rommel was now facing his greatest challenge not against a foreign enemy, but against the harsh realities of war in Europe. As he arrived in France, Rommel found himself confronted with a different kind of warfare. The beaches of Normandy, the cliffs of the Atlantic Walrus, was no desert landscape. The defense of France would require new strategies, new thinking. And Rommel, ever the innovator, would be forced to adapt once more. Despite the overwhelming odds, Rommel began to pour his energy into defending the western coast of Europe. He was determined not to let the Allies gain a foothold. His efforts to strengthen the fortifications of the Atlantic Wall became legendary. Rommel's experience in North Africa, where he had used mobility and surprise to his advantage, now had to be applied in entirely different conditions. He was fighting against the clock, trying to prepare Europe for a battle that could very well decide the outcome of the war. But despite Rommel's best efforts, the situation continued to deteriorate. The Allies were making significant progress, especially with the successful day landings in June 1944. Rommel, who had initially been confident that the Allies could be stopped, now saw that victory was slipping away. The Battle of Normandy and the subsequent push into France was a devastating blow to Rommel's defensive strategy. The Allies had come prepared, and Rommel's forces were unable to halt their advance. Despite his extraordinary leadership, Rommel was forced to watch as the tide of the war shifted against him. But it wasn't just the war that was closing in on Rommel. Behind the scenes, a different kind of battle was unfolding. Rommel, who had long been admired by both the German public and the military, began to realize that his position in Hitler's regime was becoming increasingly precarious. Rommel, known for his tactical genius and his outspoken nature, had begun to grow disillusioned with Hitler's leadership. The final chapter in Rommel's story would not be written on the battlefield. As Germany's defeat became inevitable, Rommel's fate took a tragic turn. A conspiracy was brewing within Germania group of officers who sought to overthrow Hitler and end the war. Rommel, unwilling to support a madman like Hitler, was secretly linked to the resistance. On the 14th of October 1944, Rommel was given an impossible choice. After being implicated in the plot to assassinate Hitler, Rommel was forced to take his own life. Under intense pressure, and knowing the alternative was certain death for himself and his family, Rommel chose to end his life on his own terms. Rommel's death marked the end of an era. The Desert Fox, once hailed as a brilliant commander, was now a symbol of the tragic toll war takes on its heroes. His death sent shockwaves through Germany, and he was mourned by many who saw him as one of the last honorable men in the Nazi regime. But even in death, Rommel's legacy lived on. His tactics, his leadership, and his spirit would be studied by future generations of military leaders. His story, one of brilliance, resilience, and ultimately tragedy, would forever be remembered as a testament to the cost of war. Erwin Rommel's life ended tragically, but his legacy lives on, resonating far beyond the fields of battle. In the years following his death, Rommel became more than just a brilliant tactician. He became a symbol of both military excellence and moral complexity. Though he served in the Nazi regime, Rommel was never a blind follower. His actions on the battlefield often showed a respect for humanity that set him apart from many of his contemporaries. Rommel was known for treating prisoners of war with dignity and for his honorable conduct, even in the chaos of the most brutal campaigns. His reputation was one of a soldier who, despite being entrenched in one of history's darkest conflicts, maintained a sense of honor. Rommel's brilliance was undeniable. His military tactics, bold, swift, and innovative, became the hallmark of his career. His leadership was studied and admired, not just in Germany, but across the world. the desert fox, as he came to be known, had an unmatched ability to inspire his men, to rally them in the face of adversity, and to consistently outthink and outmaneuver his opponents. His influence on military strategy remains significant to this day. However, Rommel's legacy is far from simple. His association with Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime cast a shadow over his achievements. He was a man who, despite his moral compass, was entangled in a brutal and corrupt system. The question of whether Rommel was a hero or a man caught in the machinery of war has never had a simple answer. His story is one of brilliance and tragedy, of a soldier who did his duty, but who ultimately paid a heavy price for his association with a regime he could no longer support. In the end, Rommel's forced death by suicide after his involvement in the failed assassination attempt on Hitler revealed the immense internal conflict he faced. A man who had dedicated his life to his country only to be forced to take his own life to protect his family from Nazi retribution. His death symbolized the ultimate cost of war. Not just the lives lost on the battlefield, but the crushing toll it takes on the soul. Rommel's passing marked the end of an era where his exceptional military genius would never be matched again. Yet, his name remains, not just as a legendary general, but as a reminder of the complex and often tragic interplay between a soldier's duty and the moral choices they face. Rommel's legacy is one of both admiration and controversy. Was he a hero for his remarkable military achievements, or was he a tragic figure trapped in a war that demanded too much of him? Perhaps both. His legacy is a testament to the intricate nature of history, where even the brightest stars can be obscured by the darkness they were forced to navigate. As we remember Erwin Rommel, we are reminded of the true cost of war, not just the battles fought on the ground, but the battles fought within the hearts of those who lead them. So, what do you think of Rommel's legacy? Was he a hero, a villain, or something in between? Share your thoughts below, and let's keep the conversation going.
He was once beloved by the people of Rome, a young emperor who promised to restore the greatness of the empire. But just 4 years into his reign, Caligula transformed into one of the most notorious figures in history. A man who believed he was a god, he ruled with absolute terror, indulging in bizarre and cruel acts that would turn Rome into a living hell. How did this once promising emperor descend into madness, and what drove him to commit unspeakable atrocities? Join us as we uncover the shocking story of Caligula the emperor who shattered the very foundations of Rome. Manius Aurelius Caligula was born in 12 AD, into a world of political intrigue and instability. His father Germanicus was a popular and respected general of the Roman Empire, beloved by the people and admired for his military prowess. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was the granddaughter of Emperor Augustus, giving Caligula a prestigious lineage that set the stage for his future as a potential heir to the imperial throne. However, tragedy struck early in Caligula's life. At just 7 years old, Caligula's father Germanicus died under mysterious circumstances. His death, though officially attributed to natural causes, was believed by many to be the result of poisoning possibly orchestrated by Tiberius, the then emperor of Rome. who had become increasingly paranoid and suspicious of potential threats to his power. After his father's death, Caligula, along with his mother and siblings, was left to fend for themselves in a Roman political climate that was growing more dangerous by the day. Caligula's early life was filled with hardship and loss. His mother Agrippina was imprisoned by Tiberius, and his family was embroiled in a series of political purges. His childhood was marred by the death of his relatives, many of whom were executed or exiled. Caligula, once surrounded by the wealth and influence of his family, was left vulnerable and isolated. However, he was also shaped by the harsh lessons of survival in a cutthroat political environment. It was during these formative years that Caligula developed a sense of fearlessness and ambition, traits that would define his future reign as emperor. In 31 AD, after Tiberius's death, Caligula, then in his late 20s, was named emperor. Initially, his ascension to the throne seemed like a breath of fresh air for Rome. After years of suffering under Tiberius's oppressive rule, the people hoped that Caligula would be different. At first, he was everything the Romans had hoped for. He freed prisoners, recalled exiles, and made grand promises of reform. His reign began with a wave of popular support, and it seemed that he would bring a new era of prosperity and stability to the empire. However, the early months of Caligula's rule quickly gave way to signs of erratic behavior. What had initially been seen as a period of rejuvenation soon began to unravel as the emperor started to show a darker side. Caligula's behavior shifted dramatically after a brief but serious illness that left him bedridden for several months. The recovery period that followed marked a turning point in his reign that would take the empire into a terrifying new era. As the months passed, Caligula's rule grew more unpredictable and more tyrannical. What started as an odd quirk soon escalated into acts of cruelty and madness. The same emperor who had once been embraced by the Roman people now sought to control them through fear. His desire for absolute power led him to do the unthinkable. He declared himself a living god, ordering the construction of a temple to house a massive statue of himself, which he insisted be worshipped. This marked the beginning of a reign characterized by cruelty, paranoia, and a complete disregard for human life. Caligula's madness manifested in various ways. She engaged in bizarre public displays, including forcing the Senate to worship him as a divine being, and he even appointed his favorite horse, Incitatus, as a consul. This was not just an eccentric gesture. Caligula's actions were meant to demonstrate his absolute power over the empire and mock the Senate and the political structures that had once governed Rome. His disregard for tradition and his growing obsession with divinity alienated many of his supporters, and his reign became increasingly unpopular among the elite of Rome. Caligula's insanity also manifested in a reign marked by extravagant spending, public executions, and violent purges. He began to execute those who displeased him, and many in the Senate lived in constant fear of being accused of treason. His acts of cruelty weren't just limited to his political rivals. She regularly humiliated the Roman aristocracy and created a reign of terror where no one was safe from his whims. Caligula had gone from being a promising emperor to a ruthless tyrant, but his descent into madness was far from complete. His reign would soon reach new heights of depravity, as the empire would face its most terrifying moments. What drove him to commit unspeakable acts? And what could possibly stop the emperor who had everything and yet lost his sanity? As Caligula settled into his reign, the seeds of tyranny began to sprout, and what had initially been seen as eccentricities quickly escalated into something far more sinister. His early acts of cruelty shocked the Roman populace, but his true madness unfolded with the unrelenting force of a storm. The emperor, once seen as a savior after the death of Tiberius, now began to show his true colors that were drenched in blood and madness. One of the most notable early signs of Caligula's insanity was his obsession with power. He began to view himself as a god, demanding that the people of Rome worship him. He ordered that his statues be placed in temples, and even in Jewish synagogues, something that would have been considered an outrageous affront to many. The Senate, once a powerful body, found itself marginalized as Caligula consolidated all authority into his hands. The emperor's ego grew as he surrounded himself with sycophants, further isolating himself from the very people he was supposed to serve. His arrogance became legendary, and his belief in his own divinity grew stronger with each passing day. By 39 AD, Caligula's cruelty was no longer limited to his political opponents. He began to target those closest to him, friends, family, and even those who had once supported his rise to power. His first major act of terror came when he ordered the execution of his own cousin Tiberius Gemellus, and exiled his mother-in-law, the influential Agrippina the Younger. The violence did not stop there. Caligula's paranoia and jealousy led him to order the executions of other prominent figures, including members of his own family. He even went as far as accusing his sisters of adultery and having them executed, fearing that their influence would undermine his absolute rule. While Caligula's behavior was shocking, his cruelty toward his closest allies was just the beginning. His thirst for absolute control grew, and the people of Rome became increasingly terrified of his unpredictable nature. The emperor's psychological instability reached new heights as he became obsessed with the idea of omnipotence. His lavish spending spiraled out of control, with his extravagant building projects and massive expenditures draining the imperial treasury. He ordered the construction of palaces, temples, and theaters, monuments to his power that symbolized the emperor's descent into madness. One of the most notorious acts that Caligula engaged in during this period was his obsession with the military. No longer content with simply ruling from Rome, he decided to embark on a military campaign in Gaul, one that would showcase his supposed divinity to the people. Caligula, in a fit of delusion, claimed that he had been given divine orders to lead an army against Neptune, the sea god. He famously marched his troops to the shores of Gaul and commanded them to collect seashells as spoils of war, a bizarre spectacle that left many soldiers and citizens bewildered. This victory over the sea god was one of the most absurd moments of Caligula's reign, and became a symbol of his unhinged rule. Caligula's madness extended to his personal life as well. His relationships with his sisters, most notably Drusilla, took a dark turn as he became obsessed with them, to the point of engaging in incestuous relationships. Caligula's infatuation with his sisters and his unrestrained desire for power began to dominate his actions. He sought to elevate them to divine status, declaring one of his sisters, Julia Livilla, as a goddess. His sexual exploits were a spectacle in Rome, and the emperor began to flaunt his power by committing acts of sexual debauchery and violence. These actions shocked even his most loyal followers, yet no one dared to challenge his rule. At the same time, Caligula began to openly mock the very institutions that had once held Rome together. He ridiculed the Senate, stripping it of any remaining power, and surrounded himself with flatterers and corrupt officials. The emperor's sense of invincibility grew to the point where he made brazen decisions to humiliate Rome's most respected officials. One of his most infamous acts was appointing his favorite horse, Incitatus, as a consul, a political office that was traditionally held by the Roman elite. The appointment, though often seen as a joke, was a devastating commentary on Caligula's contempt for the Roman political system and his absolute disregard for tradition. He sought to demonstrate his power not just through cruelty, but by rendering the very structures of Roman governance meaningless. Caligula's actions began to reach a fever pitch, and the people of Rome were caught in a wave of terror. The emperor's paranoia made everyone suspect no one was safe from his wrath. Executions were carried out with no trial, and entire families were wiped out at his command. Caligula's brutality was not just about consolidating power, it was about instilling fear in everyone who had ever opposed him. The emperor reveled in his role as a tyrant, no longer caring about the well-being of the empire or its people. His rule had become a theater of cruelty and madness, and the streets of Rome were filled with whispers of rebellion, though no one dared speak too loudly. Caligula had made a mockery of the Roman Empire, reducing its once proud institutions to mere puppets of his own ego. But his reign of terror could not continue indefinitely. His enemies, both inside and outside of his court, began to rally against him. Would his reign of madness end in his downfall? Or would the emperor's insanity lead him to destroy everything and every around him? As Caligula's reign grew ever more tyrannical, the whispers of dissent turned into a loud murmur. For the people of Rome, Caligula's transformation from a promising emperor to a psychotic tyrant was a nightmare. No one was safe from his wrath, and even his closest allies began to see the true nature of his cruelty. As his paranoia deepened, Caligula increasingly relied on a network of informants and spies, ensuring that he could root out any possible threats to his power, but his madness would eventually catch up with him. By 41 AD, Caligula's reign had become unbearable. His cruelty, unpredictability, and unchecked power had created a climate of fear in the empire. Even his once loyal supporters began to grow weary of his madness. The Senate, which Caligula had once sought to humiliate and disempower, began to secretly plot against him. Conspiracies were brewing, and the inevitable clash between the emperor and his own political class was fast approaching. Though Caligula had no shortage of enemies, one of the most significant groups plotting his downfall came from within his own inner circle. Members of the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers responsible for guarding the emperor, had grown disillusioned with their emperor's erratic behavior. They saw the emperor as a liability, someone whose madness could bring ruin to the empire. A few senators, feeling powerless and desperate, joined forces with the guards, seeking a way to end Caligula's reign of terror once and for all. In early 41 AD, the conspirators saw their opportunity. They made their move while Caligula was attending a series of performances in a theater. The emperor had recently made a habit of parading through the streets, forcing the people to honor him and view him as a god. On the fateful day, Caligula had been making his usual rounds, enjoying his absolute power and basking in the attention. But the conspirators saw it as the perfect moment to strike. Caligula's assassinators moved quickly. The Praetorian Guard, led by Cassius Chaerea, a senior officer in the imperial bodyguard, launched a coordinated attack on the emperor. Caligula was stabbed multiple times by Chaerea and his co-conspirators. Some accounts say that the emperor was caught by surprise, as he was not expecting such an assault from those he had trusted. Others claim that, despite being caught off guard, Caligula fought back, but his assailants overpowered him. The assassination was brutal, and swift. Caligula's life was violently snuffed out. The immediate aftermath of his assassination sent shockwaves through Rome. The city was plunged into chaos as the news of Caligula's death spread. His reign of terror was finally over, but the empire was left to deal with the aftermath of the madness that had gripped it for 4 years. The death of Caligula marked the end of an era, one that had seen the Roman Empire torn apart by the whims of a single insane ruler. However, Caligula's death did not bring immediate peace or stability to Rome. The conspirators who had killed him faced their own challenges. Though Caligula was gone, the political vacuum left in his wake was vast, and the chaos of his rule left many unsure of the empire's future. The Senate, though instrumental in the emperor's death, was cautious about what to do next. With Caligula's body discarded, his reign was over, but the fight for control of Rome was just beginning. Caligula's assassination may have ended his tyrannical rule, but his death was not the final chapter in the story of his empire. As Rome attempted to move forward, questions about his legacy and the trauma caused by his reign lingered. What became of the empire in the wake of such madness? Would the people ever be able to recover from the horrors they had witnessed under his rule? Caligula's death did not immediately restore peace to Rome. In fact, it left the empire in a state of confusion and power struggles. The Senate, which had plotted his assassination, did not immediately take power. Instead, the Roman people who had lived under the reign of a man they had once revered found themselves uncertain of what would come next. Caligula had removed anyone who could challenge him, and many of his enemies were now dead or exiled. His death left a void of leadership, and while some celebrated the end of his tyranny, others feared the potential collapse of the empire. The death of Caligula led to the rise of a new emperor, his uncle, Claudius, who was declared emperor by the Praetorian Guard. Claudius's ascension to the throne, though marked by political intrigue, offered Rome a sense of stability after the chaos of Caligula's reign. Claudius was far more measured and restrained than Caligula, and his reign would see the empire recover from the devastation caused by his predecessor. Caligula's legacy, however, remained a dark stain on the history of Rome. His name became synonymous with cruelty, madness, and tyranny. For centuries, historians would recount the horrors of his rule, and his story would serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power. His reign was one of the darkest periods in Roman history, and his legacy lived on as a symbol of the devastating impact one individual's madness could have on an entire empire. Though his reign was short-lived, Caligula's name would echo through the annals of history. His insanity was studied, his atrocities discussed, and his rise and fall became a tragic example of the dangers of unchecked power. The Roman Empire, though scarred by his reign, would continue on, but the memories of Caligula's madness would forever remain ingrained in the Roman psyche. As we look back on the reign of Caligula, we're left to wonder, what made a ruler who started with such promise descend into madness? How could a man, once seen as the future of Rome, become a living nightmare for the empire he ruled? The story of Caligula is one of both ambition and madness, a lesson in the dangers of absolute power and a stark reminder of the fragility of human nature. After Caligula's death, the Roman Empire was thrust into turmoil. The emperor, whose reign had been marked by terrifying madness and cruelty, had left behind a legacy so deeply rooted in fear and chaos that the shockwaves of his actions reverberated through Rome long after his assassination. Yet, even in death, Caligula's story was not over. His reign had set in motion a series of events that would forever alter the course of Roman history. As the Senate debated who should succeed Caligula, there was one figure who was not initially considered a man who had been largely ignored and underestimated. Claudius, Caligula's uncle, had spent most of his life in the shadow of his more powerful relatives. A man often mocked for his physical disabilities and considered too weak to rule, Claudius was hardly a figure of ambition or intrigue. Yet, in the wake of Caligula's assassination, Claudius found himself declared emperor by the Praetorian Guard, who had seized control of the situation. Claudius's rise to power was, in many ways, a twist of fate. He had been spared the brutality of Caligula's reign. His awkward manner and perceived weaknesses had kept him out of the emperor's cruel schemes. Yet, his ascension to the throne was far from smooth. While many in Rome were still reeling from the horrors of Caligula's reign, others feared that the madness could return with a new emperor. Claudius, however, brought a different approach to governance. Rather than acting impulsively and erratically like Caligula, he worked to stabilize the empire. Despite his initial lack of political experience, Claudius proved to be a shrewd and capable ruler. His first actions as emperor were aimed at restoring order. He ordered an end to the purges, pardoning many of those who had been implicated in Caligula's brutal regime. Claudius also sought to rebuild the empire's finances, which had been drained by Caligula's extravagant spending. He implemented policies that aimed at restoring the Senate's power, but in a way that did not allow them to overstep their boundaries. Claudius's approach to leadership was cautious but effective, and it helped to gradually restore some semblance of stability to a fractured empire. Yet, as Claudius began to assert his authority, the shadow of Caligula's legacy loomed large. The memory of the insane emperor remained fresh in the minds of the Roman people, and the empire's political landscape was still in disarray. But Claudius's reign was not without its own challenges, and his ability to navigate the complex political world of Rome was put to the test. Despite his early successes, Claudius was unable to completely rid the empire of the corruption that had plagued it under Caligula's rule. The Senate, while more subdued, still held significant power and often sought to undermine his decisions. Claudius's greatest test, however, came not from the Senate or the empire's political elite, but from his own family. While Caligula's reign was characterized by violence and excess, Claudius's rule was marred by intrigue and betrayal within his own bloodline. His wife, Messalina, was notorious for her infidelity and manipulations, and it was rumored that she had a hand in several political assassinations. In 48 AD, Messalina's own ambition led to her downfall. She was executed for her involvement in a plot to overthrow Claudius, an event that deeply shook the emperor's trust in those closest to him. Despite his personal losses, Claudius worked to solidify his legacy and continue the empire's expansion. Under his rule, Rome saw significant military victories, including the conquest of Britain in 43 AD, which became one of his greatest achievements. Claudius's administration was marked by improvements in infrastructure, legal reforms, and a greater emphasis on the welfare of the Roman people. However, the empire's recovery from Caligula's reign was slow. and the political instability continued to simmer beneath the surface. Caligula's legacy of madness and violence could not be easily erased, and even Claudius, who had worked hard to rebuild the empire, found himself haunted by the consequences of the previous emperor's actions. The fear and terror that had characterized Caligula's reign left an indelible mark on Rome, and it would take time for the people to recover from the trauma of his rule. But Caligula's influence did not end with his death. His reign had forever changed the way Rome viewed its emperors, and his actions had set a dangerous precedent for future rulers. As Claudius's reign continued, the empire would face new challenges, some directly linked to the madness of Caligula. What would become of the legacy of Caligula in the centuries that followed? Would the horrors of his rule echo throughout Roman history? Or would Rome move past the shadow of its most infamous emperor? Though Caligula's immediate reign ended with his assassination, the impact of his madness was felt for generations. The empire, though temporarily stabilized under Claudius, would never truly forget the horrors of Caligula's rule. The insanity and cruelty of the emperor had set a precedent that would haunt the empire for years to come. Even as Rome expanded and thrived under new leadership, the memory of Caligula lingered in the minds of both the Roman people and their rulers. Subsequent emperors, such as Nero, would come to embody the same unpredictability and excess that Caligula had displayed. Nero, like Caligula, would face immense criticism for his erratic behavior, even as his reign was marked by excesses, cruelty, and the destruction of Rome itself. The Roman Empire's history would continue to be shaped by emperors who, like Caligula, were products of the same system that had given birth to one of the most infamous leaders in Roman history. Yet, despite the darkness that Caligula's reign brought to Rome, his story has continued to captivate historians, filmmakers, and storytellers alike. The emperor's descent into madness, his tyrannical rule, and his shocking actions continue to fascinate and terrify. His name has become synonymous with cruelty, insanity, and unchecked power, and his legacy has lived on as a warning of what happens when a ruler is given too much authority. As we look back on Caligula's reign, we are left with many unanswered questions about the true nature of his insanity. Was it a product of his circumstances, or was it inherent in his character? The story of Caligula raises profound questions about power, madness, and the human cost of absolute rule. His legacy, both terrifying and fascinating, is a reminder of the fragile line between greatness and destruction. Caligula's reign left a lasting mark on the Roman Empire, but the question remains, what exactly was his legacy? The madness and excess that defined his rule left Rome reeling, but also forged a path for future emperors who would find themselves haunted by the example he set. While his assassination may have ended the immediate chaos, the echoes of his tyranny reverberated through the empire for decades. After Caligula's death, Rome did recover, but the scars of his reign were not easily erased. Claudius, who succeeded him, worked hard to stabilize the empire, but the damage caused by Caligula's extreme behavior could not be undone overnight. Caligula's violent purges, his lavish spending, and his blatant disregard for Rome's traditions had made Rome a volatile place. His reign had shown the Roman people how quickly an emperor could transform from a benevolent ruler to a tyrannous idea that would continue to plague Roman politics for years to come. The Senate, once a proud and influential body, was weakened beyond repair during Caligula's reign. The emperor had stripped away their power and mocked their authority, leaving them in a subservient position that many in the Senate never recovered from. When Caligula died, the Senate was left with little influence, and the balance of power in Rome was permanently altered. His actions had irrevocably shifted the dynamic between emperor and Senate, creating an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that would persist in the empire for generations. Caligula's reign also left an indelible mark on the psyche of the Roman people. While the Roman Empire would continue to thrive for centuries, the memory of Caligula's madness lived on in stories, warnings, and cautionary tales. The emperor's descent into madness became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked power, and his name became synonymous with tyranny, cruelty, and insanity. His reign demonstrated the terrifying consequences of a ruler who believed they were above reproach. whose ego and ambition led them to destroy everything around them. In the years that followed Caligula's death, many rulers would rise to power who were just as tyrannical and ruthless, though none perhaps as flamboyantly cruel as Caligula himself. Nero, who came to the throne decades after Caligula, would engage in many of the same excesses, squandering the empire's resources, committing atrocities, and engaging in self-indulgent behavior. While Nero's reign was not identical to Caligula's, it was marked by similar patterns of violence, extravagance, and madness. And like Caligula, Nero would leave behind a legacy of devastation and fear. Caligula's reign had also shifted the public perception of Roman emperors. Before him, emperors like Augustus and Tiberius were seen as rulers who upheld the values of the Roman Republic, even if their methods were occasionally harsh. But Caligula shattered that image, showing that an emperor could be both godlike and insane, both a ruler and a tyrant. His reign demonstrated that absolute power, unchecked and uncontested, could transform a once popular leader into a figure of unimaginable cruelty and fear. His insanity became a reflection of the dangers inherent in centralized authority. Caligula's legacy also made its way into Roman art, literature, and culture. His reign, for all its horror, captured the imagination of later generations. Poets, playwrights, and artists chronicled his depravity, crafting stories of his wild excesses, his twisted relationships with family members, and his bizarre orders. His story became a cautionary tale of power gone wrong, a lesson to future rulers about the dangers of tyranny and unchecked ambition. Despite his reign ending in violence and chaos, Caligula's name continued to linger in the Roman consciousness. The idea of the mad emperor became a lasting cultural symbol, used in literature and rhetoric to warn of the dangers of despotism. Caligula's life served as a dark mirror for future rulers, reminding them of the dangers of losing touch with reality and the horrific consequences of pursuing power at any cost. Caligula's madness may have ended with his death, but the empire he left behind was forever changed. His reign had shown the world the extremes of human nature and the corruption that comes with absolute power. His story reminds us that even in the most powerful empires, the potential for madness exists, and the line between godlike authority and terrifying cruelty is thin indeed. His legacy is not just one of horror, but also one of caution, a reminder that the madness of one ruler can change the course of history. As we reflect on Caligula's reign, we must ask ourselves, how did such a man ever rise to power? What allowed Caligula to gain the trust of the people, only to turn that trust into an empire-wide nightmare? The question of what made him go mad remains unanswered, but the story of his reign serves as a timeless lesson. As his madness became legend, so too did the empire he ruled, forever haunted by the ghost of its most insane emperor. Caligula's reign, though short, left a scar on the history of the Roman Empire. From promising beginnings to an unimaginable descent into madness, his story remains one of the most chilling tales of absolute power gone wrong. The emperor who started as a beacon of hope for Rome ultimately turned the empire into a living hell, shaping the future of Roman rule and leaving behind a legacy that continues to fascinate and horrify. As we reflect on the life of Caligula, we are left to wonder, what could have caused a man with so much promise to spiral into insanity? What does his tragic story teach us about power, paranoia, and the human capacity for cruelty? Was Caligula born to madness? Or was his insanity the product of a system that granted him too much power? We'd love to hear your thoughts on the legacy of Caligula. Do you think his madness was inevitable? Or could Rome have avoided the horrors of his rule? What can we learn from the rise and fall of this infamous emperor? Leave your thoughts and theories in the comments below. If you found this documentary fascinating, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with others who are intrigued by the darkest chapters in history. Caligula may have been a madman, but his story is a stark reminder of the dangers that come with unchecked power. In our next episode, we'll dive into the life of another infamous Roman ruler, Nero. Known for his brutal rule and alleged role in the burning of Rome, Nero's reign was marked by violence, extravagance, and a disregard for the welfare of his people. Was he a madman like Caligula? Or was his reign the result of political ambition gone wrong? Join us as we uncover the fascinating and terrifying history of Nero. Like, subscribe, and click the notification bell to stay updated on our latest episodes.
She came from humble beginnings, a princess from a foreign land, married off to a Russian heir, and yet Catherine the Great would rise to become one of the most powerful monarchs in history. She was the woman who ruled Russia with an iron fist, shaping an empire that would endure for centuries. But how did this outsider become the empress of one of the largest nations on earth? Was it sheer ambition, or was there something more behind her rise to power? Join us as we uncover the remarkable story of the woman who defied expectations, outsmarted rivals, and ruled like a king. The year was 1729, and a young princess named Sophie Friederike Auguste von Anhalt-Zerbst was born in Stettin, Prussia. She was not of royal blood, but she came from a noble family, one that was keenly aware of the power struggles of European courts. Sophie's life would not follow the path of most women of her time. She was destined to break away from the limitations of her birth and ascend to a throne far grander than anyone could have imagined. At the age of 14, Sophie was married off to the heir of the Russian throne, the future Emperor Peter III. This alliance, formed by the power dynamics of European politics, seemed like a great opportunity, but it would prove to be a rocky and unfulfilling match. Sophie, soon to be known as Catherine, moved to the Russian Empire with high hopes, but the reality of her new life was far from what she had envisioned. Russia, at the time, was under the rule of Empress Elizabeth, a woman of tremendous power and authority. But Elizabeth's reign was also marked by intrigue and manipulation, and Catherine's arrival in the Russian court would see her plunged into a world of political games and personal rivalries. She was far from home, in a court that was as foreign to her as the land she now ruled. Catherine, however, was no stranger to strategy. She quickly adapted, learning the intricacies of Russian politics, culture, and language. But it was not just her wit that would propel her rise, it was her ambition and determination to succeed. Her marriage to Peter III, though, was an unhappy one. Peter, the heir to the Russian throne, was eccentric, immature, and uninterested in ruling. He was often preoccupied with his obsession with Prussia and military affairs, leaving Catherine to navigate the tumultuous waters of Russian aristocracy alone. Despite her growing frustration with her marriage, Catherine found solace in the political power she began to amass at court. It wasn't long before she began to see her husband's weaknesses, and it was from these very weaknesses that her own opportunities for power began to emerge. Peter's reign was weak, and his lack of support from the Russian nobility only made his position more tenuous. Catherine, understanding the shifting tides of power, forged relationships with key military leaders and court figures, quietly amassing support. She knew that one day she would have to take matters into her own hands. Little did she know, the moment of opportunity would soon come. But Catherine's rise to power would not be a simple affair. She would have to navigate not only a failing marriage, but a deeply divided court. Could this young princess, who had once been a mere foreigner in the Russian court, truly seize the throne and rule like a king? The story of how she would do so begins with a shocking act that would forever change Russia. By 1762, Catherine's marriage to Peter III had soured beyond repair. The man she had once hoped would help lead Russia into a new era had turned out to be incompetent, impulsive, and deeply unpopular with the Russian people. His alienation of both the court and the military left him with little support, and it wasn't long before Catherine began to see the opportunity to step into the role of ruler herself. Peter's reign had been marked by bizarre decisions, including his fascination with Prussia and his disregard for Russian traditions and customs. He was often ridiculed for his odd behavior, and many within Russia saw him as unfit to rule. Catherine, on the other hand, was shrewd and capable, already gaining influence within the court. Her intelligence, political acumen, and ability to navigate the complexities of Russian nobility set her apart from her husband, who had failed to secure the loyalty of the military and key advisors. Though Catherine's position as the empress was not yet secure, she quickly began to solidify her support among Russia's elite. She sought the backing of the military, the church, and influential courtiers, knowing that she could not succeed without their endorsement. Her charm and diplomatic skills were unmatched, and she built a network of loyalists who would eventually help her secure her claim to the throne. In 1762, the opportunity finally arrived. Peter III, having alienated nearly every faction of Russian society, was overthrown in a coup. It was a bloody and swift transition. Catherine, with the support of the military and key leaders within Russia, seized the throne. Peter was arrested, and his reign, which had lasted just 6 months, came to a humiliating end. He was forced to abdicate, and shortly afterward, he was murdered under mysterious circumstances. Catherine, now Empress of Russia, had secured her place at the head of one of the world's largest empires. Despite her coup, Catherine knew that her position was still fragile. She faced opposition from within her own court, as many saw her as an outsider. She was a German-born princess who had married into the Russian royal family, and many still questioned her legitimacy as ruler. However, Catherine was determined to prove herself, and she wasted no time in consolidating her power. Her first steps as empress were aimed at shoring up support among Russia's military and political elite. She sought to stabilize the country after the chaos of Peter III's reign, and prove that she was not only capable of ruling, but capable of leading Russia into a new age of prosperity. Catherine took great care in establishing her authority, ensuring that she was seen as a strong, effective ruler by her subjects. Her reforms in government, education, and the military were designed to modernize Russia and strengthen its place on the world stage. Yet, Catherine's rise to power had not come without its challenges. She was now the ruler of an empire, but ruling like a king was not as easy as it seemed. Would her strength and determination be enough to solidify her reign, or would the powerful forces at court plot against her? As Catherine's rule began, the question of whether she could sustain her power and prove herself as one of history's greatest monarchs remained unanswered. One of Catherine's early challenges came from a group of nobles who viewed her as a threat to their own influence. These nobles, accustomed to wielding significant power within the court, were reluctant to embrace a woman as their ruler. However, Catherine used her political savvy to navigate these challenges. She made concessions to the nobility, granting them privileges and keeping them loyal to her reign. At the same time, she took steps to weaken their power, ensuring that they would not be able to challenge her authority. Catherine also had to contend with the growing unrest among the common people. While her reign was marked by significant reform, Russia remained a land of stark inequality. Serfs were bound to the land and subjected to harsh conditions, and many saw Catherine as a monarch who had not done enough to address their plight. The Pugachev Rebellion of 1773 to 1775, a large-scale peasant uprising, posed a serious threat to her rule. The rebellion, led by the Cossack Pugachev, was fueled by anger over economic hardship and the oppressive conditions under which the serfs lived. The rebellion was a reminder that Catherine's rule, though secure, was fragile, and that she had to balance her reforms with the realities of her empire. But Catherine would not be deterred by rebellion or resistance. She knew that her reign would be defined by her ability to balance the needs of the nobility, the military, and the common people. Would she be able to hold her empire together, or would the same forces that had toppled her husband threaten her rule? And in the end, would she be remembered as the woman who ruled like a king? By 1770, Catherine the Great's reign was becoming a beacon of Russian strength and influence. She had overcome internal opposition and civil unrest, proving herself not just as a ruler, but as an empress capable of modernizing Russia. With her ambitious reforms and determination to lead her empire into the modern age, Catherine achieved what few monarchs could dream of: absolute power that was accepted by the Russian nobility, the military, and even the common people. Her reign, however, was not without its trials. Catherine's internal reforms were ambitious, and she sought to centralize control over a vast empire stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean. She worked tirelessly to streamline the Russian bureaucracy, introduce more Western ideals, and implement legal reforms that would protect the rights of the landowners and nobility, while laying the groundwork for Russia's greater involvement in European politics. Her attempts at reform, particularly with the Nakaza document outlining the principles of law for Russia, showed her commitment to Enlightenment ideals, but the reality of enforcing such changes was much more complex. Russia, despite Catherine's best intentions, remained largely feudal. The empire's economy relied heavily on serfdom, and many of her reforms, though progressive in theory, did not immediately improve the lives of her subjects. In fact, the growth of her power and the expansion of Russia's territory came with a heavy price for the serfs, many of whom were subjected to even harsher conditions under the noble landowners. While Catherine's vision for reform was vast, she often had to make concessions to the aristocracy, which limited her ability to enact true social change. However, her reign was also marked by one of her greatest successes, the expansion of Russian territory. Catherine's military campaigns, particularly her victories against the Ottoman Empire and Poland, allowed her to extend Russia's borders significantly. She annexed the Crimea in 1783, securing Russia's dominance in the Black Sea and transforming Russia into a major European power. Her victories over the Ottoman Empire were significant, giving her access to new territories and trade routes, and elevating Russia's status among the great powers of Europe. But Catherine's territorial expansion did not come without challenges. Her military campaigns, though successful, were costly. The war against the Ottoman Empire drained Russian resources, and the conflict over Poland would eventually lead to the country's partition in 1795. In the end, Catherine's vision for Russia as a European power came at a steep cost, and she struggled to balance the demands of war with the needs of the empire. Though Catherine was a strategic genius and a skilled ruler, the pressures of her reign were beginning to take a toll. The further expansion of Russia had created new problems that she was not always able to control. The nobility remained powerful, and the serfs continued to suffer. Would her legacy be defined by her triumphs, or would the growing unrest within Russia threaten to undermine all that she had worked for? As Catherine's reign continued, internal strife escalated. While she had made great strides in solidifying Russia as a European power, the social unrest caused by the treatment of serfs remained one of her greatest challenges. The Pugachev Rebellion of 1773 to 1775, which erupted in the southern provinces, was one of the largest uprisings during her reign. Led by Yemelyan Pugachev, a Cossack leader who claimed to be Peter III, the rebellion was a reaction to the worsening conditions of the serfs and the resentment toward Catherine's reforms. The rebellion spread rapidly, and Catherine was forced to call upon her military to put down the insurgents. The rebellion was brutally suppressed, but it left a lasting impact on Catherine. It served as a stark reminder of the limits of her power and of the deep divisions in Russian society. While Catherine had maintained her rule through military might and political maneuvering, the forces of unrest simmering within the empire were impossible to ignore. After the rebellion was quelled, Catherine took measures to secure her reign. She implemented stricter control over the serfs and reinforced the power of the nobility to prevent further uprisings. Yet, the Pugachev Rebellion marked a turning point, highlighting the ongoing tension between the desires of the ruling class and the plight of the lower classes. Despite these challenges, Catherine continued to project an image of absolute authority. She was a woman who had ascended to the throne through ambition, cunning, and a willingness to fight for power, and she ruled Russia with the confidence of a king. Her reign became synonymous with power, both on the battlefield and in the court. Catherine's ability to wield power, despite her gender and her foreign birth, was a testament to her strength and intelligence. However, as Catherine's reign entered its final years, the question remained: could her empire survive the forces she had unleashed? Was Russia truly on the path to greatness, or was her vision of a powerful, modernized empire ultimately unsustainable? Catherine's reign was marked by both triumphs and contradictions. She expanded Russia's territory, modernized its economy, and established herself as a powerful monarch. Yet, she was also faced with internal opposition, military costs, and social unrest. Despite these challenges, Catherine remained one of the most significant and influential rulers in history, having secured her place among the greatest monarchs of all time. Her final years saw her continuing to expand Russia's influence, both through diplomacy and military might. Yet the deep-seated issues within Russian society, the treatment of the serfs and the power of the nobility, remained unresolved. Catherine's death in 1796 marked the end of an era, and though her son Paul I succeeded her, he could not maintain the same level of power and influence she had wielded. Catherine's legacy, however, would live on as a powerful woman who had ruled Russia with a king's authority and vision. As Catherine's reign ended, her legacy would be debated by generations to come. Was she a reformer who helped shape Russia into a modern empire, or was she a monarch who, despite her ambition, failed to truly change the structure of Russian society? What would history remember her for, the woman who ruled like a king, or the empress whose reign left deep divides in Russian society? While Catherine's reign appeared secure, her rise to power was far from conventional, and as her reign progressed, cracks began to show. Though she had come to power through political maneuvering and revolution, she had become a figure who embodied the very authority she had once fought against. Catherine's commitment to westernizing Russia and introducing Enlightenment ideals placed her in an uncomfortable position. She had promised change, but the societal and structural systems that upheld her reign remained stubbornly entrenched. She had ruled with the strength of a king, yet her legacy would always be defined by the tension between progress and tradition. One of the most surprising twists of Catherine's reign was her relationship with the nobility. Initially, Catherine had sought to curtail their power and elevate the influence of the people, particularly the serfs. But as time passed, she made concessions to the aristocracy to ensure her reign remained stable. This decision would come back to haunt her. The nobles, who had once supported her rise to power, now held Catherine in an ever-tightening grip. She had promised reforms to empower the common people, but in the end, her alliances with the nobility ensured that the status quo largely remained. Perhaps the most significant twist in Catherine's reign came in the form of the Charter of the Nobility in 1785. This document granted immense privileges to the nobility, essentially giving them control over their serfs and removing any restrictions on their power. In exchange, the nobles pledged loyalty to Catherine's rule. This move, while designed to ensure the support of the aristocracy, angered the serfs, and many felt betrayed by their empress. The Charter of the Nobility was a pivotal moment, as Catherine had promised reform, but this law deepened the divide between the classes. It was a decision that weakened her image as an enlightened monarch and left her vulnerable to criticism. Was Catherine the Great truly the reformer she had promised to be? Or had her attempts to consolidate power led her to embrace the very forces of oppression she had once sought to dismantle? Was her legacy defined by her military victories and territorial expansion, or by the compromises she made to maintain control? As her reign continued, Catherine found herself more entangled with her political allies and more distanced from the people she had promised to empower. The expansion of the Russian Empire had brought immense wealth and power, but it had also exposed Russia's inherent inequalities. While Catherine had been an ambitious leader, seeking to expand her borders and solidify Russia's place as a global power, she had ultimately compromised on the very ideals that had brought her to power. The promises of enlightenment and equality were undone by the harsh realities of maintaining an empire. The question of Catherine's true legacy became even more apparent during her final years. While she had been hailed as an enlightened monarch by many, her legacy remained divisive. Her refusal to grant significant reforms for the serfs, along with her decision to empower the nobility at their expense, led to growing resentment among the lower classes. Though Catherine had built a powerful empire, it was an empire sustained by a system of inequity and exploitation. Even more surprising was Catherine's handling of the Pugachev rebellion, which had caused her to turn her back on any hope for reform. She had initially supported some ideas that would give the serfs more rights, But after the rebellion, she cracked down with an iron fist. Thousands of peasants were executed, and many more were forced into harsher conditions. The rebellion had left Catherine with no choice but to reinforce the structures of power that had made her rule possible. She had to secure the loyalty of the nobles and maintain control over the military and serfs to protect her empire. Yet, despite the growing unrest, Catherine's power remained unchallenged for the most part. She was a woman who had ruled with the strength of a king, but was her empire truly a reflection of the vision she once had for Russia? Was her legacy built on her political cunning, military conquests, and imperial expansion, or on the compromises that left her reign defined by oppression? As the years wore on, Catherine's image as an enlightened monarch began to fray. Though she had been a patron of the arts and a lover of philosophy, her actual governance was marked by authoritarianism and an unwillingness to address the deeply entrenched inequalities of Russian society. Catherine the Great had transformed Russia into a European power, but at what cost? The wealthy nobles and the military elite had benefited from her reign, but the serfs had seen little improvement in their lives. At the end of her reign, Catherine left a Russia that was greater than it had ever been before in terms of territorial size and influence. Yet, the cracks in her reign had become evident, and her legacy was now under scrutiny. Catherine's death in 1796 marked the end of a significant era, but it also left questions lingering about the empire she had built. Her successors, including her son Paul I, would struggle to maintain the empire she had crafted, and the problems she had avoided during her reign would eventually lead to the Russian Revolution more than a century later. Even after Catherine's death, her reign left an indelible mark on Russian history. But was her legacy ultimately one of triumph or tragedy? Could Catherine the Great have ruled differently, leaving a more lasting legacy for the people of Russia? And, in the end, was she the true ruler of the empire, or was she the product of a system that demanded her compromises? After her death in 1796, Catherine the Great left behind a monumental legacy that continues to spark debate even today. On one hand, her reign was a time of unprecedented growth for Russia, a time when the empire expanded vastly, when Russia's power was solidified on the world stage, and when the arts and sciences flourished under her patronage. Yet on the other hand, her reign was marked by stark contradictions. While Catherine famously championed Enlightenment principles, her policies often maintained or deepened the social hierarchies that made her empire both vast and vulnerable. Catherine the Great is often remembered for her extraordinary military conquests. Under her rule, Russia gained significant territory, including the Crimea, parts of Poland, and much of the Black Sea region. These victories secured Russia's position as a dominant European power, but at a steep price. The territorial expansion, although beneficial for Russia's influence, was primarily achieved through the oppression of others, including the serfs. While Catherine sought to modernize Russia and open up its society to new ideas, she simultaneously entrenched the autocratic rule that defined her reign, giving the nobility more power while offering little real improvement for the common people. Despite her modernizing efforts, particularly in the legal and educational systems, the inequality within Russian society was never addressed to the extent it needed. Catherine's legacy is, in many ways, a reflection of her contradiction. She was both a reformer and a conservative, a patron of progress and a protector of the existing power structure. The Nakaz, her famous code of law, reflected her belief in Enlightenment ideals, yet the harsh realities of Russian serfdom remained virtually unchanged throughout her reign. Perhaps the most significant part of Catherine's legacy is her impact on Russia's status in Europe. She not only expanded the Russian Empire, but also established Russia as a European power to be reckoned with. Through strategic alliances and diplomatic savvy, Catherine worked tirelessly to ensure that Russia was seen as a major player on the European stage. Her correspondences with figures like Voltaire and Diderot placed her within the intellectual circles of Europe, further solidifying her image as an enlightened monarch. However, Catherine's efforts to reform and modernize Russia often fell short of their lofty ambitions. The reforms she enacted, particularly those aimed at the serfs, were largely ineffective. Her decision to support the aristocracy and their control over the serfs created a system of oppression that would continue to define Russia for years to come. The Pugachev Rebellion, which threatened her reign in the 1770s, was a stark reminder that the revolution that had brought Catherine to power could easily be turned against her. In suppressing the rebellion with ruthless force, Catherine reinforced the very system that had created unrest in the first place. But while Catherine's reign may have had its flaws, her influence on Russia and the world was undeniable. What can we learn from her rise to power and her reign? Was she truly the powerful ruler she is often portrayed to be, or was she a monarch whose successes were overshadowed by the deep divisions within her empire? In the years following her death, Catherine's image would evolve. To some, she would be remembered as one of the greatest rulers in Russian history, a monarch who expanded Russia's borders, elevated its status, and brought a sense of cultural enlightenment. To others, however, she remained a symbol of the contradictions inherent in autocratic rule. A ruler who, despite her claims to modernize, ultimately kept the power of the elite intact while leaving the common people in poverty. The Russian Empire Catherine left behind would continue to grow under her successors, but the seeds of unrest had been sown. The inequality between the nobility and the common people, the suffering of the serfs, and the lack of meaningful reform would eventually lead to the Russian Revolution more than a century later. While Catherine the Great had consolidated power and secured her legacy, her inability to address the fundamental social issues that plagued Russia left a divided society that would struggle with its identity for generations. Yet, Catherine's name lives on as one of history's most remarkable women. Her ability to rise to the top in a male-dominated world of monarchs and military leaders is nothing short of extraordinary. She ruled Russia like a king, wielding absolute power with grace, strategy, and intelligence. Her reign marked a period of great accomplishment, but also one of great contradiction, and in many ways, Catherine the Great embodied the complexity of Russian history itself. Her story is a powerful reminder that no monarch, no matter how enlightened or powerful, can escape the inevitable tensions between reform and tradition, between progress and resistance. What if Catherine had pushed further, had taken the risks necessary to create a more egalitarian Russia? Could she have been the monarch to lead Russia into a new era, or was the very nature of Russia's autocratic system doomed to keep her ambitions in check? The legacy of Catherine the Great is one of transformation, power, and paradox. She ruled like a king, but her reign was shaped by the delicate balance of power between the elite and the oppressed. Her vision for Russia, while groundbreaking in many ways, was limited by the realities of the system she inherited. Catherine may have expanded Russia's borders, modernized its culture, and made it a formidable force in Europe, but in doing so, she also ensured that the deep divides within Russian society would persist long after her death. Catherine the Great's reign may have been a triumph for Russia, but it was also a warning. The forces of change and resistance are never easy to reconcile, and no ruler can escape the tensions that define their time. As we reflect on her legacy, we must ask ourselves, was Catherine truly the woman who ruled like a king? Or was she a monarch caught between progress and tradition, between her own ambitions and the power structures that defined her empire? Catherine the Great's reign was filled with triumph, contradiction, and complexity. She transformed Russia into a great European power, but in doing so, she also left behind a legacy of inequality, oppression, and unfulfilled promises. Was she the powerful monarch she's often remembered as? Or was she ultimately a ruler caught between her ambitions and the forces of tradition? Her rise to power and the choices she made during her reign forever shaped Russia, but the question remains, could she have done more? As we look back on Catherine's legacy, we can't help but wonder, what if she had been able to reform Russia's social structures more deeply? Could she have been the monarch to truly elevate the common people, or was the Russian system too entrenched for any reform to be lasting? and how much of Catherine's success was built on the compromises she made with the nobility. Her story reminds us that even the most enlightened rulers can face the inescapable tension between progress and tradition. Now, it's time for you to decide. Do you think Catherine the Great was a monarch who truly ruled like a king, or was she a ruler bound by the constraints of her time? What part of her legacy do you think is the most significant, and what could she have done differently? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Was Catherine the Great the powerful leader she is remembered for? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Catherine the Great's extraordinary reign, make sure to like and subscribe. We'll continue exploring history's greatest figures, the decisions that defined them, and the legacies they left behind. You won't want to miss our next episode. In our next episode, we'll explore another powerful female ruler, Cleopatra. Was she the seductress history often portrays her as, or was there more to her rule and intelligence than meets the eye? Get ready for a new look at the Queen of the Nile and how her alliances shaped the fate of Egypt and Rome. Like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell to stay updated on our latest episodes.
A blizzard rages on the frozen, desolate landscape of Finland. Through the snow, a lone figure lies in wait. His rifle is steady, his breath silent. One shot, one kill. But this isn't just any sniper. This is Simo Häyhä. Known as the White Death, he killed over 500 soldiers in less than 3 months. In the icy depths of the Winter War, how did this man become one of the deadliest snipers in history? And how did his actions change the course of a war? From humble beginnings in the frozen Finnish countryside to becoming a living legend, Simo Häyhä's journey is one of survival, precision, and war-changing consequences. Born in 1905 in the small village of Rautjärvi, Finland, Simo was raised in a farming family. Life was hard, and survival in the harsh Finnish wilderness meant learning to live off the land. Simo, even as a child, developed a sharp eye for shooting. Hunting animals to feed his family, he became known for his deadly aim and patience. Finland's traditions of marksmanship, hunting, and outdoor survival shaped Simo's character. Little did he know, these early lessons would soon help him become the most feared sniper of the Winter War. In the late 1930s, Europe was heading toward war, and in 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland. The Soviet forces vastly outnumbered the Finnish soldiers, but the Finns weren't backing down. The Winter War had begun, and Finland's survival depended on its people's resilience. It was in these desperate times that Simo Häyhä would rise from a quiet farmer to one of the deadliest men in the conflict. Simo's sniper career began as soon as he joined the Finnish army. His natural skills, honed over years of hunting, would become a vital asset to Finland's defense. The terrain of Finland, covered in deep snow and dense forests, gave soldiers like Simo a tactical advantage. The Soviets, used to larger-scale, open battles, struggled to adapt to Finland's guerrilla warfare tactics. But it wasn't just the terrain that made Simo a formidable force. His rifle of choice was the Finnish M28/30, a simple, reliable weapon. Unlike most snipers, Simo didn't use a scope. Instead, he relied on the rifle's iron sights, which allowed him to remain virtually invisible to the enemy. He made the most of the natural cover the snow and trees provided, moving silently and staying hidden for hours, sometimes days. Simo Häyhä's rise to legendary status came during the brutal battles of the Winter War. In less than 3 months, he claimed over 500 confirmed kills. Every shot was precise, every movement calculated. The Soviet soldiers began to fear him, and the stories of the White Death spread throughout their ranks. His presence on the battlefield wasn't just a physical threat, it was psychological warfare. Soviet troops began to panic, unable to predict where he would strike next. This fear, coupled with his unmatched accuracy, made Simo one of the most dangerous men to ever fight in the Winter War. Simo Häyhä was not just another sniper. His tactics were unconventional but extremely effective. He preferred to remain completely still, blending with the snow-covered landscape, often waiting for hours, or even an entire day, for the right moment to take a shot. His patience and ability to endure the cold were legendary. While the Soviets struggled with freezing temperatures, Simo thrived. In the freezing wilderness of Finland, the Soviet forces, ill-prepared for such conditions, struggled to advance. Simo's sniper position wasn't just about shooting, it was about disrupting the Soviet strategy. With every shot, he picked off key soldiers, disrupted supply lines, and sowed chaos in enemy ranks. One of the most famous moments of Simo's career was during the battle at Kala. Despite being surrounded by Soviet forces, Simo managed to hold his position and continue picking off soldiers. It was here that his reputation as an invincible sniper began to grow. The Soviets feared the idea of facing him because it meant death, often without warning. Though the Finnish soldiers were vastly outnumbered, Simo Häyhä's relentless accuracy and ability to strike fear into the hearts of Soviet troops made him an invaluable asset to Finland's defense. His feats were so remarkable that even the Soviet high command had to take notice. They attempted to locate and eliminate him, but Simo's ability to remain undetected, even in the most dangerous of situations, was unmatched. As the Winter War progressed, Simo Häyhä's reputation grew stronger. The Soviet soldiers, who once thought they had the upper hand, began to fear one name: the White Death. This wasn't just a nickname, it was a psychological weapon that shook the Soviets to their core. Simo's skill in remaining unseen in the unforgiving Finnish snow made him a phantom on the battlefield. His accuracy, even at great distances, was unmatched, and the stories of his exploits spread quickly among enemy ranks. The most iconic chapter of his legend unfolded during the Battle of Kola in 1940. This pivotal battle was crucial for the Finnish defense, as Soviet forces were pushing hard to capture key positions. The odds were stacked heavily against the Finns, but Simo was there to tip the balance. Surrounded by Soviet troops, Simo held his position, taking shot after shot, picking off soldiers one by one. His marksmanship wasn't just about the kill sit, was about the incredible nerve to keep fighting, even when the enemy closed in. The Battle of Kola became a turning point for both Finland and for Simo. His actions inspired not just his fellow soldiers but the entire nation. His kills disrupted Soviet tactics and forced the enemy to constantly watch their backs, unable to predict where the next shot would come from. Despite being vastly outnumbered, the Finns held strong, and Simo's contributions played a key role in that. Simo didn't just target regular soldiers. He focused on officers, snipers, and other key threats that could change the course of a battle. His patience was unparalleled. He would often lie in wait for hours, even an entire day, to get the perfect shot. While the Soviets were struggling to adapt to the cold and the terrain, Simo had already mastered it. He understood how to use the snow and the forests to stay hidden and undetected, making him a near ghost on the battlefield. Simo Häyhä's impact during the Winter War cannot be overstated. He wasn't just a sniper. He became a living nightmare for the Soviet forces, and his actions altered the course of the war. As the war dragged on, the Soviet army grew more desperate to eliminate him. They deployed massive search efforts, hoping to hunt down the White Death who was disrupting their advance. But Simo, with his unmatched ability to stay hidden in the snow, was a ghost to the enemy. In 1940, during the final months of the Winter War, Simo had his most successful stretch. He achieved an astonishing 500 confirmed kills in just over 70 days, with estimates ranging higher. This made him the deadliest sniper of the war, if not the most deadly in history. Simo's method was deceptively simple but devastatingly effective. He would wait in ambush, often without moving for hours, allowing the enemy to come close, then take precise shots with his iron-sighted Mosin Nagant M28/30 rifle. It was in this stillness that Simo's incredible mental discipline shone. He didn't just rely on his training, he relied on the raw will to endure the conditions and stay composed, no matter how long it took to line up the perfect shot. One of the most remarkable aspects of Simo's skill was his understanding of the terrain and the environment. Finland's snow-covered landscape gave him the perfect camouflage. Unlike most snipers who relied on scopes, which made them more visible, Simo used iron sights. This decision kept him concealed and prevented his position from being detected by enemy counter-snipers. He also took advantage of the terrain by using snowbanks as natural shields. In fact, Simo was so good at using the terrain that Soviet forces often found themselves shooting at snowdrifts, thinking they were targeting him. It was the combination of his patience, precision, and deep knowledge of the land that made him virtually untouchable. However, the Soviets didn't give up. They knew they had to neutralize Simo if they had any hope of breaking the Finnish defense, so they resorted to extreme measures. They attempted to overwhelm his position with heavy artillery. They deployed counter-snipers and even used dogs to track him down. Yet Simo remained elusive. He would stay hidden for hours or even a whole day, waiting for the right moment to strike. On several occasions, Soviet forces launched full-scale attacks in an attempt to flush him out. But they were always met with the same result: failure. The legend of Simo Heihe grew not just because of his impressive kill count, but because of the psychological warfare he waged against the Soviet army. The more kills he racked up, the more nervous and paranoid the Soviet forces became. They would constantly move at night to avoid being targets, creating confusion and disarray within their ranks. Soldiers, knowing that Simo could be anywhere, started to fear the very snow around them. The psychological toll was enormous, and it was here that Simo's influence on the battlefield went beyond just the physical. His mere presence sent shockwaves through the Soviet forces, impacting their morale and making them question their strategy and leadership. Throughout this time, Simo's reputation spread far beyond the battlefield. The Soviet Union had put out massive rewards for anyone who could capture or kill the White Death, but none succeeded. His story became a symbol of Finnish resolve and the determination to defend one's homeland at all costs. The Winter War itself was a conflict where the underdog seemed destined to lose. Yet, Simo's skill and the Finnish fighting spirit gave hope to the nation and made the world take notice of their defiance against a vastly superior force. But while his battlefield reputation was growing, Simo remained an enigmatic figure. He was quiet, reserved, and never sought fame or recognition for his actions. He was motivated by duty and a deep sense of loyalty to his country and comrades. Despite the admiration he garnered from soldiers and civilians alike, Simo avoided the spotlight. He wasn't interested in the accolades or the fame that came with being one of the deadliest men in history, was only focused on winning the war for Finland. As the war dragged on, Simo's contributions became even more crucial. He didn't just work alone. He coordinated with other Finnish snipers, creating a network of sharpshooters that systematically hunted down Soviet targets. His presence allowed Finnish forces to make a significant impact on Soviet lines, particularly in their efforts to disrupt supply lines and weaken Soviet morale. The more Soviet soldiers he took out, the more Finland's resistance grew stronger. Despite his extraordinary success, Simo's war was not without its costs. The extreme conditions of the Winter War took a toll on him. On the 6th of March, 1940, after months of being pinned down in the snow, Simo's life as a sniper would be interrupted. While engaging Soviet troops, he was shot in the face by a Soviet sniper, leaving him severely wounded. The bullet hit him in the jaw and left him with a horrific injury that would end his sniper career. However, Simo was resilient. He survived the injury and eventually returned to Finland, where he was treated for his wounds. After Simo Heihe was injured in 1940, his days as a sniper came to an end, but his contribution to the Winter War wasn't finished. Despite being severely wounded by the Soviet sniper's bullet, he survived and eventually returned to Finland after his recovery. The legend of the White Death was far from over, and his story continued to inspire Finnish soldiers and civilians alike. Simo was awarded several medals for his bravery and outstanding contributions to Finland's defense, but he remained humble, never seeking fame or recognition. He returned to civilian life, living as a farmer and largely avoiding the spotlight. The country had been through so much, and Simo's role in the defense of Finland had made him a national hero, though he never considered himself one. After the Winter War ended in 1940, Finland faced even more challenges. The Continuation War, which began in 1941, saw Finland once again fighting against the Soviet Union. Though Simo didn't return to the front lines as a sniper, he rejoined the military, continuing to serve as a soldier. He saw action in the Continuation War, but in a different role, focusing on other aspects of the military effort. His time in the field may have been over, but the lessons he imparted during the Winter War shaped Finnish tactics and strategies for years to come. Simo's legacy didn't end with the war. After his military service, he lived a peaceful life, but his story continued to captivate the world. He became a symbol of determination, courage, and skill qualities that were essential in the defense of Finland during one of the most brutal conflicts of the 20th century. His status as one of the deadliest snipers in history ensured that he would always be remembered, not just as a soldier, but as a national hero whose actions helped define Finland's resistance against Soviet aggression. Though Simo's physical wounds healed, the scars of war were more than just physical. As with many veterans, Simo carried the emotional toll of war for the rest of his life. He remained a quiet, private man, often avoiding public appearances, but his influence remained undeniable. He became a symbol of Finland's unyielding spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. Simo Häyhä lived until 2002, passing away at the age of 96. His death marked the end of an era, but his legacy continues to live on. Today, he is remembered, not only for his incredible skill as a sniper, but for his profound impact on the Winter War and the history of Finland. Simo's life and his actions during the Winter War remain a testament to the power of individual courage, resilience, and the spirit of a nation fighting to defend its home. Simo Häyhä's life after the war wasn't just about military accolades or his status as a national hero. It was about the lasting impact he had on his country and the world. Despite his extraordinary military achievements, Simo was a deeply private man who sought to live a life of humility and simplicity. He returned to his home in Finland, focusing on farming and avoiding the media's attention. For most of his life, Simo preferred to stay out of the public eye, choosing a quiet existence over fame. However, as time went on, his story continued to inspire new generations. Books, documentaries, and even movies began to recount his incredible feats in the Winter War. Simo became a symbol of the Finnish resistance, embodying the determination, courage, and selflessness of the Finnish people during the harshest days of the war. He was not only revered in Finland, but also gained international recognition as one of the deadliest snipers in history. Even though Simo never sought recognition, his legacy remained deeply embedded in Finnish culture. He became a symbol of strength and resilience, a reminder that even against overwhelming odds, the will to fight can prevail. In Finland, he was regarded as a hero, not just for his impressive kill count, but for his unwavering commitment to his country. His life also sparked discussions on the psychological effects of war. Simo, like many soldiers, carried the emotional weight of his experiences throughout his life. He rarely spoke about the war or his time as a sniper, but his legacy provided a platform for deeper conversations on the impact of war on mental health. As the world began to acknowledge the toll of war on soldiers, Simo's life provided insight into the inner struggles of those who fought in wars that seemed endless. Though Simo never had children, his legacy lives on through the countless individuals inspired by his story. Today, visitors to Finland can see monuments and memorials dedicated to Simo Häyhä, including a statue in his hometown of Rautjärvi, where he is remembered as one of the greatest soldiers in Finnish history. His grave, too, remains a point of homage for those who wish to pay their respects to a man whose actions in the Winter War made him one of the most iconic military figures of the 20th century. Simo Häyhä passed away in 2002 at the age of 96, leaving behind a legacy that continues to resonate. His story remains an enduring symbol of the power of determination, the sacrifices made in the defense of a homeland, and the quiet strength of a man who faced extraordinary challenges with unshakable resolve. As we reflect on Simohehe's life, it's worth considering the extraordinary impact of a single individual on the course of history. His contributions weren't just measured by the number of kills he made, but by the ripple effect his actions had on the war, his country, and the world. His story is a reminder that heroism doesn't always come with the fanfare or recognition that many expect, but it can change the world just the same.
He could have become a king, but he chose to be something else, a symbol of democracy. George Washington, the first president of the United States, was not just the leader of a revolution. He was the father of a new nation. From humble beginnings to commanding a fledgling army, Washington's decisions and actions would set the stage for the United States to rise from the ashes of war. But what made him choose selflessness over power? Why did he walk away from the throne instead of accepting the adoration of a nation in need of a monarch? Join us as we explore the life of George Washington, the man who made the impossible possible and set the standard for future leaders of America. George Washington was born on the 22nd of February 1732 in Westmoreland County, Virginia. At first glance, his early life might seem ordinary, a son of the Virginia gentry. His family, though not part of the British aristocracy, owned a large plantation. His father, Lawrence Washington, was a wealthy landowner who had served in the colonial military. However, George's life took an early turn when, at the tender age of 11, his father passed away, leaving young George and his siblings to navigate the world without a paternal figure. It was this loss that set the stage for the independence and determination Washington would become known for. As a young man, Washington's education was not particularly formal, but it was practical. He was tutored by his older brother Lawrence, who introduced him to the world of military strategy, farming, and business. But it was Washington's sense of duty and desire to succeed that drove him to pursue a career in surveying, the perfect occupation for someone who was as ambitious as he was resourceful. At just 16 years old, he began working as a land surveyor in the Virginia frontier, gaining invaluable knowledge of the land and the rugged terrain of the colonies. This experience would shape his understanding of geography and military tactics, which would serve him well in later years. By 1753, as tensions between the British and the French were escalating in North America, Washington's military career began. At the age of 21, he was appointed lieutenant colonel in the Virginia militia and sent to the Ohio River Valley to confront the French, who were attempting to expand their influence in the region. Washington's first military engagement, however, ended in a disastrous defeat at the Battle of Fort Necessity. Though he was forced to surrender, Washington's handling of the situation earned him respect as a leader capable of handling difficult circumstances. It was clear he possessed a natural ability to lead, despite his inexperience. His experience in the French and Indian War, which would later merge into the broader 7 Years' War, made Washington a hero in Virginia. As he rose through the ranks, Washington's understanding of military strategy deepened. He was involved in numerous campaigns, some successful, some less so. Despite setbacks, Washington's resilience in the face of adversity and his ability to rally his troops won him the admiration of his peers. His bravery on the battlefield during the war cemented his status as a capable officer. But more than anything, the war marked a significant turning point in Washington's life: his deep dissatisfaction with British rule and the realization that colonial self-governance was inevitable. After the war, Washington retired to his estate at Mount Vernon, but the idea of standing idle was never in his nature. By this time, colonial America had begun to feel the first waves of discontent toward British rule. The British Crown imposed harsh taxes and laws on the colonies, most notably the Stamp Act and the Tea Act, that were met with increasing resistance. Washington, who had always believed in the rights of the colonies, was swept up in the growing movement for independence. While many of his fellow Virginians, and indeed many of his fellow Americans, remained loyal to the British Crown, Washington began to speak out against the policies of King George III. His frustration with British interference in colonial affairs particularly in Virginia, laid the groundwork for his support of independence. In 1774, as tensions reached a boiling point, Washington was elected to represent Virginia in the Continental Congress. His entry into the political arena was driven by a deep sense of duty to his country. He was not an idealistic revolutionary, nor a radical, was a pragmatic leader who understood the magnitude of the decisions before him. Washington believed the colonies had a right to self-governance, but he also feared that an outright rebellion against Britain could tear the colonies apart. Nevertheless, when the colonies began to raise militias and resist British authority, Washington knew he had to take action. The moment that truly transformed Washington from a political figure into a legendary leader came in 1775, when the Continental Congress appointed him Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. His appointment wasn't simply a formality. Washington was an experienced military leader, well respected by his peers, and known for his ability to maintain composure under pressure. But the responsibility of leading an army to fight one of the most powerful military forces in the world would be his greatest challenge. At the time, the Continental Army was poorly equipped, underfunded, and made up of inexperienced soldiers. Washington knew that the war would not be won overnight. His first task was to unify the diverse colonies into a cohesive fighting force. He inherited an army filled with men who were not professional soldiers but farmers, tradesmen, and laborers, many of whom had joined the army out of duty, not passion. Washington understood that in order to win, he would need not only to command his army, but also to inspire it. Despite a series of early defeats, including the loss of New York City, Washington's leadership began to shine. His ability to inspire his men, maintain morale, and secure victories in key battles, such as the crossing of the Delaware River and the subsequent victories at Trenton and Princeton, demonstrated Washington's military prowess. These early victories revitalized the morale of the Continental Army and gave hope to the people of the colonies, showing that they could indeed challenge British might. Washington's journey from military leader to the face of the American Revolution was marked by his resilience, humility, and ability to rally people around a common cause. But as the war dragged on, would his leadership be enough to see the colonies to victory? The greatest test of his character and his vision for a new America was still ahead. Could the Continental Army endure the hardships of war? And could Washington hold the fragile unity of the Revolution together in the face of growing opposition, both from within and without? The Revolutionary War continued to wear on throughout the 1770s, and George Washington's leadership was tested at every turn. After the pivotal victories at Trenton and Princeton, Washington knew that the key to securing independence was not just winning battles, but sustaining a long-term campaign against the British. While the Continental Army had managed to outlast the British at key moments, Washington's army was still plagued by a lack of resources, poor training, and a deeply divided political climate at home. Washington understood that while the war could be won, it would require far more than military strategy. It would take political savvy, international diplomacy, and sheer perseverance. As the war continued into the winter of 1777, the Continental Army faced its darkest moment at Valley Forge. The conditions at Valley Forge were brutal. Freezing temperatures, scarce food supplies, and rampant disease left thousands of soldiers in dire conditions. Yet, amid the suffering, Washington's leadership shone brighter than ever. He refused to abandon his troops, knowing that morale was as important as military success. Under his guidance, the army began to rebuild itself, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. Washington took the opportunity to reorganize and train the troops, enlisting the help of foreign officers like Baron von Steuben, who introduced the Continental Army to rigorous drills and discipline. The difficult winter at Valley Forge was not just about surviving the cold. It was about laying the groundwork for a much stronger, more effective fighting force. The transformation of the Continental Army during this time would prove to be a turning point, as the ragtag group of soldiers began to show signs of becoming a well-trained, formidable military force. Throughout the next several years, Washington's determination to lead was tested again and again. As British forces continued to mount offensives, especially in the southern colonies, the Continental Army had to rely on its resilience and ability to stretch limited resources. The difficulties in recruiting soldiers and maintaining public support for the war effort were constant hurdles. In addition to the logistical challenges, Washington faced internal divisions within the Continental Congress and the military itself, with some factions criticizing his leadership, questioning his strategy, and even calling for his replacement. Despite these challenges, Washington's leadership continued to inspire the Continental Army and the American people. When word arrived that the French government, led by King Louis XVI, had agreed to provide military assistance to the American cause in 1778, it was a major turning point. France's involvement in the war changed the balance of power, giving the American colonies the support they desperately needed to counter British superiority. Washington's ability to unite the colonies and forge an alliance with France demonstrated his diplomatic skill and reinforced his position as the central figure in the American Revolution. The summer of 1781 marked the final stages of the Revolutionary War, and Washington's leadership was again put to the test. In the critical siege of Yorktown, Washington coordinated with French forces, led by General Rochambeau, and together, they trapped British General Cornwallis and his army. The successful siege, which lasted for weeks, was a stunning victory for the Continental Army and its French allies. On the 19th of October, 1781, General Cornwallis, unable to continue fighting, surrendered to Washington, effectively ending the war and securing American independence. Although Washington had won the war, his victory was not without consequences. The newly formed United States of America, though free from British rule, was a fragile and fragmented nation. The Articles of Confederation, the first attempt at a national government, created a weak central authority that struggled to address the economic and social problems facing the country. Washington, having played such a critical role in the war, found himself drawn back into public life as the nation grappled with the challenge of forming a stable government. After the war, Washington returned to his home at Mount Vernon, hoping for peace and a return to his private life, but the struggles of the fledgling nation could not be ignored. The very survival of the country depended on its ability to establish a functional government. Washington knew that without a strong central government, the United States would remain vulnerable to external threats and internal discord. Would he return to public service once again, or would the nation's fate be left to others? In 1787, Washington was called upon once more to serve his country, this time not as a military leader, but as a guiding hand in the formation of a new government. The Constitutional Convention convened in Philadelphia, and Washington, ever the patriot, was unanimously elected as president of the convention. His role in the drafting of the U.S. Constitution was pivotal, as he helped mediate debates and encourage compromise among the delegates. Washington's presence at the convention was crucial. He was seen as the one figure who could unite the diverse interests of the states and provide legitimacy to the new framework for government. The Constitution, though it created a strong federal government, was still a radical idea, and its passage was far from guaranteed. Washington was crucial in ensuring the Constitution's ratification by lending his prestige to the process. His leadership during this time earned him the admiration of many, and when the Constitution was finally adopted, it was clear that Washington would be the first choice for the presidency. By 1789, with the country's new government taking shape, Washington was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States. His presidency would set the precedent for every president that followed, establishing the role of the executive branch and guiding the young nation through its formative years. Washington's leadership would not be about imposing his will, but about serving the nation's interests, upholding the principles of liberty, and ensuring that the government operated within the framework of the Constitution. Washington's presidency was about to begin, and with it came an immense responsibility to set the example for all future presidents. How would he navigate the complexities of governing a new nation, balancing the competing interests of states, the federal government, and foreign powers? Could the leader who had won a revolution now secure the future of the United States and ensure that the young country would thrive? After years of leading a revolution, George Washington now stood at the helm of a fledgling nation. The United States had won its independence, but the hard work of building a stable and prosperous country was just beginning. The task before Washington was monumental. He needed to create the new government, establish a functioning economy, secure foreign alliances, and perhaps most importantly, ensure the survival of a democracy that had never been tried on such a scale. His presidency, more than any other, would set the foundation for the United States as we know it today. Upon taking office in April 1789, Washington immediately faced a host of challenges. The most pressing issue was the creation of a stable government that could govern the nation effectively. The U.S. Constitution had set up the structure of government, but there were no precedents, no guidebook for how the branches of government should function in practice. The question of what role the president should play was one of the most significant uncertainties. Should the president be a strong leader with broad powers, or should he be a figurehead with limited influence? Washington, always careful and methodical, understood that the way he governed would set a precedent for generations to come. Washington quickly established important traditions. He created the executive cabinet, an unprecedented move composed of individuals who would serve as his closest advisors. He appointed Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, and Henry Knox as Secretary of War. Washington relied heavily on these men, particularly Hamilton, whose financial acumen would play a pivotal role in the nation's early survival. Washington set the precedent for how the executive branch would operate, but perhaps more importantly, he set the example of moderation and restraint in his leadership, firmly establishing the idea that the presidency should not become an office of unchecked power. One of Washington's earliest and most critical decisions was his stance on foreign relations. The United States was still a weak nation in the eyes of Europe, and Washington was determined to steer clear of entanglements that could drag the country into unnecessary conflicts. He famously issued the Proclamation of Neutrality in 1793, signaling to the world that the United States would remain neutral in the wars between France and Great Britain. This decision was controversial at the time, particularly among those who supported France, but Washington believed that staying out of European conflicts was crucial for the young nation's survival. His decision to avoid alliances set a precedent for American foreign policy, which remained largely isolationist for much of the 19th century. Another defining moment of Washington's presidency was the establishment of the nation's financial system. The United States was deeply in debt following the Revolutionary War, and Hamilton proposed a bold plan to address the financial crisis. He advocated for the federal government to assume state debts, establish a national bank, and create a system of taxation to stabilize the economy. Washington, although initially wary of such sweeping changes, recognized the necessity of Hamilton's plan. By signing the bill to create the Bank of the United States in 1791, Washington solidified his faith in Hamilton's vision, which helped establish the financial foundation of the country. Washington's decisions on domestic policy would also have lasting effects. He signed into law the Judiciary Act of 1789, which established the federal judiciary, including the creation of the Supreme Court. This was another key moment in shaping the young country's government, ensuring that the courts would serve as an independent and powerful branch of government. Washington's appointment of the first justices, including Chief Justice John Jay, further ensured that the judiciary would be a strong, integral part of the nation's governance. Despite the successes of his presidency, Washington's time in office was not without controversy. The country was deeply divided over many issues, particularly with regard to political parties. The ideological rift between Hamilton, who supported a strong central government and a capitalist economy, and Jefferson, who championed agrarianism and states' rights, created the foundation for the first American political parties. Washington, always cautious, tried to avoid partisan politics. However, as the nation's political landscape began to divide into the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, Washington became more isolated from the growing ideological factions within his own administration. By the time Washington approached the end of his second term, the nation was on a more stable footing, but the challenges of leadership had taken their toll. As the first president, he had done what no one else had done before. He had laid the groundwork for a new government and guided the country through its formative years. But was it time for him to step down? Or would his leadership be needed for years to come? In his final address to the nation, Washington made the unprecedented decision to step down from the presidency after just 2 terms. He had accomplished what he set out to do: establish the presidency, set the foundations for government, and unite the country in its early years. Yet, Washington's decision to leave office voluntarily was just as important as the decisions he made in office. By stepping down, Washington set a powerful precedent for the peaceful transfer of power, a cornerstone of American democracy that would shape the future of the presidency. He refused to seek power indefinitely, showing that the presidency was a role for service, not for personal ambition. Washington's decision to retire from public life was met with both admiration and sorrow. The country was deeply indebted to him for his leadership, and the thought of losing such a figure was difficult to bear. However, Washington understood the importance of limiting presidential power. He recognized that the survival of the republic depended on the idea that no leader could hold power for too long. His resignation set the tone for the democratic ideals that would shape the United States for generations. Upon his departure from office, Washington returned to Mount Vernon, but his legacy as the first president was far from finished. How would future generations remember him? And how would his presidency continue to shape the future of the nation? The example Washington set as president would echo throughout American history, influencing the country's political system, foreign policy, and ideals for centuries to come. Even after stepping down from the presidency, George Washington's influence did not fade. His voluntary resignation set a precedent that no other president had the courage to challenge for decades, but it also marked the beginning of a critical reflection on the legacy of the nation he helped create. With Washington retired at Mount Vernon, the newly formed United States faced a series of challenges that would test the very fabric of what he had established during his time in office. As Washington left the Capitol, he hoped that the peaceful transfer of power would be a cornerstone of the republic he fought to build. Yet the nation's first transfer of power was fraught with struggles. Washington's successor, John Adams, took office in 1797, and though both men were of the same political faction, Adams faced a divided nation in a way that Washington had never encountered. Washington's decision to retire was now a part of his legacy, but it left a void. The system Washington had built was still young, and the country was divided by political factions. Tensions between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, led by Adams and Thomas Jefferson, created a political battleground that left the country struggling to unite under the principles Washington had instilled. Washington, though no longer in office, was still a figurehead for the nation, and many saw his absence as the beginning of the nation's struggle for unity. Would the republic survive? Or was Washington's resignation too soon, leaving the young nation vulnerable to division? He had set a precedent for the presidency, but his departure left questions about how strong the nation would remain without his guiding hand. In his final years, Washington maintained a quiet but deeply reflective position. As political tensions escalated between Adams and Jefferson, Washington's role as a leader was re-examined. Could the nation maintain the ideals Washington had instilled? Or would the growing political divisions, the rise of political parties, and the pressures of a young nation cause it to crumble under its own weight? Washington's legacy was called into question not by his actions, but by the environment that had followed his presidency. The divisive political forces, foreign affairs, and the division over issues such as the Sedition Acts and the role of the federal government made it clear that the vision of a united, neutral, and self-governed republic was far more fragile than Washington had anticipated. Adams faced foreign crises, most notably with France, and internal divisions made it difficult for the country to stand united. Was this the future Washington had hoped for? Would the experiment in democracy survive without the moral authority Washington had provided during his time in office? Through all of this, Washington remained a symbol of the pasta living reminder of the struggle and success of the American Revolution. He was often consulted by both political parties, but his counsel had less and less influence as partisan divides grew stronger. His physical health began to fail in the late 1790s, as he suffered from a variety of ailments, and his death on the 14th of December, 1799, marked the end of an era. The nation he helped to birth was now at a crossroads. Washington was gone, and with him, the simplicity and unity he had symbolized. Mini cliffhanger transition. Yet Washington's death was not the end of his influence, far from it. His legacy, while marked by the triumphs of his presidency, would continue to serve as a beacon for the generations that followed. The questions surrounding his death and the future of the United States would soon give rise to an even more profound and lasting debate. How would the country carry on without its father figure? Could future presidents fill the immense shoes Washington had left behind? George Washington's death in 1799 led to a profound outpouring of grief and reverence across the nation. The public mourning for Washington was unlike anything the young country had ever seen. He was eulogized as the father of his country, and his passing marked the end of an era in American politics. Washington's absence left the country in a state of uncertainty, but the principles he had championed the values of democracy, unity, and republicanism remained entrenched in the American ethos. Washington's death also revealed something that had been growing since his departure from office: the fragility of the ideal of unity in America. The nation that had fought for independence under Washington's leadership was now grappling with the realities of governing a diverse and divided nation. The legacy of Washington was not just in the form of his policies or decisions, but in the ideals he embodied: the idea that a republic could survive without a monarch, that power could be shared, and that a man could lead without seeking personal gain. These were the ideals that Washington had set in motion. Yet, as time went on, the question of whether America could truly live up to Washington's vision remained unanswered. Political parties had taken hold, and the country was divided not only on the issues of foreign policy, but also on the role of the federal government. Washington had feared the rise of political parties, and in his farewell address, he warned against their divisive effects. His prophecy seemed to be coming true as the Federalist and Democratic Republican parties became increasingly polarized. Washington's decision to step down and relinquish power had set an extraordinary precedent, but it was not without its consequences. In the years following his death, the legacy of his leadership would be questioned by future generations who struggled to reconcile the idea of a republic with the challenges of governing a large and diverse nation. Would the nation he helped create survive the pressures of political division and foreign intervention? His legacy, for all its achievements, would continue to serve as a touchstone for debates over power, governance, and the role of the president. Washington's example of humility and selflessness would stand as a challenge to future leaders who would face the same pressure, some of whom would be unable to live up to his ideals. As history would unfold, Washington's legacy would serve as both a guiding light and a cautionary tale for the United States. The nation he had helped to birth was not immune to the struggles of power, division, and ambition that threatened to undo the very ideals for which he had fought. How would future presidents navigate the shadow of Washington's example? And how would America's path evolve in the face of new challenges that Washington could never have foreseen? George Washington's death in 1799 marked the end of an era in American politics, yet his influence would continue to be felt across generations. As the first president of the United States, Washington not only set the stage for the young republic's survival, but also laid down the essential principles that would guide future leaders. In the years that followed, his legacy was both celebrated and contested, but his presence loomed large in the nation he had helped create. Washington's decision to step down after 2 terms set a precedent that would be followed by every president until Franklin D. Roosevelt in the 20th century. His voluntary retirement from the presidency was groundbreaking. It was a statement that power should not be concentrated in the hands of one man and that democratic systems should be self-correcting. Washington's resignation demonstrated the power of self-restraint and service to the nation, rather than personal gain. His leadership style, marked by dignity, humility, and moderation, helped solidify the very idea of the presidency in the American consciousness. The office of the president was not one of unchecked power or monarchy, but a position of responsibility, duty, and service. Washington's example was a guiding force in shaping the nature of the presidency for generations to come. Yet even as he walked away from power, his influence did not diminish. In the decades after his death, Washington became an enduring symbol of national unity. In times of division, he was invoked as a model of leadership, someone who had put country above self and had crafted a republic that, despite its flaws, was a beacon of hope for the world. His name became synonymous with patriotism, honor, and the ideals of the American Revolution. However, Washington's legacy is not without its complexities. While he is celebrated for his leadership in the founding of the United States, the reality of his role in the institution of slavery remains a dark stain on his record. Washington was a slave owner, and his views on slavery were a contradiction to the ideals of liberty and freedom that he helped champion. His relationship with slavery was complicated, and while he made efforts toward gradual emancipation in his will, he continued to enslave people during his lifetime. This tension between Washington's ideals and his personal actions is a crucial aspect of his legacy, and one that continues to spark debate among historians, scholars, and the public. Washington's legacy also extends to his influence on American foreign policy. His policy of neutrality during his presidency, enshrined in his famous farewell address, has remained a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy. Washington warned against foreign entanglements and political alliances that could drag the young nation into unnecessary wars. His advice on avoiding permanent alliances with foreign powers was instrumental in shaping American foreign policy for over a century. The idea of staying neutral in foreign conflicts, while not always adhered to in later years, continued to influence American political thought long after Washington's presidency. As time passed, Washington became more than just a political leader. He became a symbol of American ideals of freedom, independence, and unity. His image was immortalized in monuments, statues, and the names of cities and counties across the country. The Washington Monument in Washington, D.C., stands as a testament to his role as the father of the nation. And yet, even as his image was elevated to near-mythic status, the complexities of his life remained part of the national discourse. Over time, Washington's role as a leader in the American Revolution and the founding of the United States became intertwined with the broader story of the country's development. His story became one of triumph of a nation emerging from revolution and establishing a democratic system that would endure through the centuries. But Washington's legacy is not a simple one, and it is necessary to acknowledge the flaws and contradictions in his life. His failure to confront the institution of slavery fully, and his role in the perpetuation of this injustice, cannot be ignored in any honest assessment of his legacy. Yet in his time, Washington was a man who transcended his personal failings to lead the nation to victory and establish the foundations of American democracy. His commitment to the principles of republicanism and his reluctance to seek absolute power were instrumental in preventing the United States from following the path of monarchical rule that had defined much of the world. His refusal to seek a third term in office is perhaps one of his most enduring contributions, demonstrating that the presidency was meant to be a position of service, not of personal ambition. As America entered the 19th century, Washington's legacy remained deeply embedded in the fabric of the nation. But as the country grew and evolved, questions about how to interpret his leadership, his decisions, and his actions became increasingly relevant. The struggle to reconcile the idealism of the American Revolution with the reality of its practice, especially in relation to slavery, would continue to shape the national consciousness for generations to come. By the 20th century, Washington's role in the national mythos had solidified. He was no longer just a founding father, was a symbol of American greatness, a figure whose actions and decisions were the cornerstone of the American experiment. His life story became the standard by which future presidents would be measured. In times of national crisis, leaders looked to Washington for inspiration. He was a touchstone for American identity and ideals. Yet, as the United States moved through the 19th and into the 20th century, the country faced its own growing pains: wars, civil strife, and civil rights movements that tested the very foundations of Washington's vision for the United States. Washington's legacy, although revered, was not without its contradictions. While he was hailed as a visionary, his failure to address the slavery issue fully left a lasting scar on the nation. Still, George Washington's impact on the United States was undeniable. He was the man who could have ruled like a king, but chose to build something greater, an enduring republic. His leadership in the American Revolution, his role in creating the Constitution, and his presidency laid the foundation for a government that would continue to evolve over time. Washington's legacy as the first president of the United States remains as powerful as ever. Washington's leadership, while remarkable, is not without its complexities. His decisions and actions, like those of any great leader, shaped the future of the United States in profound and sometimes controversial ways. How we understand and appreciate his legacy will continue to evolve, reflecting the struggles and triumphs of the nation he helped create. George Washington's legacy, as the first president of the United States, is one of strength, humility, and unyielding commitment to the principles of freedom and democracy. His leadership shaped the very foundations of the nation, setting precedents that would guide American presidents for centuries. Yet, the complexities of his life, the contradictions between his vision for a free republic and his role as a slave owner, remind us that even the greatest leaders are products of their time. Washington's story is a reminder of the ongoing journey of the United States to reconcile its ideals with its realities. As we reflect on the life of George Washington, the man who led a revolution and established the office of the presidency, we're left with powerful questions. What do we take from his example? How do we honor his contributions while acknowledging the flaws in his legacy? Washington gave us a government based on checks and balances, a nation built on the principles of liberty, but the road to that vision was not without its struggles, contradictions, and challenges. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think Washington's legacy is defined by his actions as the first president? Or is his connection to slavery a defining flaw that must be reckoned with? How should we understand his legacy in the context of the modern world? Was he the ideal leader of a new nation, or a man bound by the limitations of his time? George Washington's life and leadership still have much to teach us today, whether it's about serving with humility, balancing power with restraint, or the ongoing struggle to live up to the ideals of liberty. What lessons can we carry with us into the future? And what aspects of Washington's leadership do you believe remain most relevant today? What is your take on George Washington's legacy? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. If you enjoyed this exploration of George Washington's life and leadership, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this documentary with others who may find it insightful. Join us as we continue to examine the lives and legacies of America's most influential figures. In our next episode, we'll explore the life of Thomas Jefferson, Washington's ally and successor, whose ideals of liberty were tested by his own actions as a slave owner. Was Jefferson truly the champion of freedom, or were his beliefs in conflict with his personal life? Don't miss out on the next chapter of America's founding story. Like, subscribe, and click the notification bell to stay updated on our latest episodes.
What if I told you that one battle changed the course of history forever? That a single military maneuver was so devastating, so unstoppable, it was feared, studied, and eventually banned. This isn't fiction. This is the story of Hannibal Barca, of history's greatest military geniuses. He didn't just defeat the mighty Roman legions, he humiliated them. And in doing so, he introduced a battlefield strategy so effective that military commanders feared it would make war unwinnable. But how did he do it? And why was his most brilliant strategy never used again? To understand, we need to go back to the very beginning of a war that would shake the ancient world. The year is 218 BCE. The Mediterranean is a battlefield of ambition, where two superpowers, Rome and Carthage, locked in a struggle that will decide the fate of the ancient world. Carthage, once a thriving empire of trade and wealth, had suffered a humiliating defeat in the First Punic War. Rome had stripped them of their naval dominance, imposed crushing reparations, and made it clear Carthage would never challenge them again. The once mighty empire was bleeding, its people seething with resentment, and its leaders desperate for redemption. But in the shadows of this defeat, a new force was rising, a man shaped by vengeance, trained for war, and destined to rewrite history. His name was Hannibal Barca. From the moment he was old enough to understand, Hannibal was taught one absolute truth: Rome was the enemy. His father, the legendary Carthaginian general Hamilcar Barca, had made him swear a solemn oath and unbreakable vow to bring destruction upon the Republic, to never stop until Rome lay in ruins. And Hannibal never forgot. He studied war like a sculptor studies marble, shaping his mind into a weapon as deadly as any blade. He learned the art of deception, the psychology of battle, and the power of turning an enemy's strength into their greatest weakness. By the time he took command of the Carthaginian army at just 26 years old, he was not just a leader, he was a master of warfare, a commander whose mind worked like no other. But he knew that if he wanted to defeat Rome, he couldn't fight on their terms. The Roman legions were the strongest military force in the known, world-disciplined, well-trained, and nearly invincible in open battle. No army had ever challenged them on their own land and survived. Hannibal needed a plan so bold, so unthinkable, that the Romans wouldn't see it coming. And so he did the impossible. Instead of attacking Rome from the sea, as they expected, he would do what no one had dared to attempt before he would march his army over the towering, frozen peaks of the Alps. A journey of over 1,500 miles, through scorching deserts, dense forests, and the most unforgiving mountain terrain in the world. He would lead an army of 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants through snow-covered cliffs and narrow, crumbling passes where a single misstep meant death. There would be no reinforcements, no supply lines, no room for error. Many believed it was madness. Some said it was suicide. But Hannibal? He called it destiny. The march began in the heat of summer, crossing the Pyrenees and carving through the hostile lands of modern-day Spain and France. He faced ambushes from savage mountain tribes, brutal desert heat, and rivers swollen with autumn rains. Yet Hannibal pressed on, each obstacle a test of his army's will. He understood that war was not just about the battlefield, it was about endurance, survival, and bending nature itself to his will. And then, as winter approached, they reached the foot of the Alps, the final barrier between them and Italy. For the men standing at the base of those towering peaks, the sight was terrifying. The mountains stretched endlessly into the clouds, a frozen wasteland of sheer cliffs and deadly avalanches. The soldiers whispered that the gods themselves had placed these mountains here to protect Rome. Hannibal saw something else. He saw opportunity. He turned to his men, his voice cutting through the howling wind. "You see those mountains? They are no different from the walls of a city, and just like any walls, they can be broken." And so, the impossible began. For 15 grueling days, the Carthaginian army clawed their way through the Alps. Freezing winds tore at their faces, food ran out, horses and elephants slipped and tumbled to their deaths. Every night, men froze where they stood. Morale began to crack. Then, the real horror struck. A deadly rockslide buried entire columns of soldiers. There was no path forward, no way back. It seemed the gods had won. But Hannibal refused to accept defeat. He ordered his men to burn massive fires against the rock, heating it until it cracked. Then, they poured vinegar over the weakened stone, shattering it into pieces. The path was open again. By the time Hannibal's army staggered out of the mountains and into the rich plains of northern Italy, they had lost nearly half their men. The mighty war elephants, once symbols of Carthaginian power, were now little more than shadows of their former selves, their bodies scarred, their eyes hollow from exhaustion. But they had done it. They had crossed the Alps. And now, they stood on Roman soil. For the first time in history, Rome was no longer safe behind its walls. What no one knew was that this march was only the beginning of Rome's nightmare. Because soon, the Romans would realize the greatest threat to their empire wasn't coming from the sea. It was already here. And it was bringing war to their doorstep. But what happened when Hannibal finally faced Rome's mighty legions? No one, Not even the greatest generals of the time were prepared for the battle that was about to unfold. The Romans never saw it coming. When reports first reached the Senate in Rome that a Carthaginian army had emerged from the Alps, there was disbelief. It had to be a mistake. No Generello army could have survived such a crossing. And yet, as scouts confirmed the impossible, Rome was forced to face a terrifying reality. Hannibal Barca was in Italy, and he was ready for war. For the first time in history, Rome itself was under direct threat from an invading army, but the Republic, always confident in its military strength, believed there was only one possible outcome. They would gather their legions, meet Hannibal in battle, and crush him like they had every enemy before him. They were about to learn that Hannibal was no ordinary enemy. Rome's first response was swift. The Senate dispatched Consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, one of their most experienced commanders, to intercept Hannibal before he could gather support in Italy. His orders were clear: engage Hannibal immediately and prevent him from gaining a foothold. But Hannibal was always one step ahead. Instead of waiting for the Romans to come to him, he struck first. At the Battle of the Trebia River, Hannibal lured the Romans into a deadly trap. He understood that Rome's strength lay in their discipline and tight formations, but he also knew how to exploit their weaknesses. In the freezing winter of 218 BCE, he baited the Romans into attacking. His cavalry harassed their camps, drawing them out in pursuit. When the Roman legions rushed forward, they were forced to cross the icy, chest-deep waters of the Trebia River. The moment the Roman soldiers waded into the water, Hannibal gave the order. His cavalry struck from the flanks, his infantry held firm, and then, from the tall grass behind them, a hidden force Carthaginian troops that had been waiting all night emerged and attacked from the rear. The Roman army was caught in a perfect trap. Thousands were cut down, their frozen bodies washing downstream. The survivors fled in panic. Hannibal had just won his first major victory on Italian soil, and he was only getting started. Rome was stunned. Never had an enemy delivered such a crushing defeat on Roman soil. But they still refused to believe that Hannibal was anything more than a temporary nuisance. They were wrong. As Hannibal moved south, he was met by another massive Roman force, this time, led by Consul Gaius Flaminius. Rome was done underestimating him. They were ready to face him in open battle. But Hannibal didn't fight open battles. Instead, he chose his battlefield carefully, a narrow valley near Lake Trasimene, where thick morning fog would roll in at dawn, concealing everything in its path. Hannibal positioned his forces in the surrounding hills, hidden from sight. And then he waited. At sunrise, the Roman army marched forward, unaware of the danger that surrounded them. The valley was silent. The lake beside them was calm. Nothing seemed out of place. Then, out of the mist, death came. Hannibal's men erupted from the hills. The Roman legions, trapped on all sides, had nowhere to run. Panic set in. The battle turned into a massacre. Soldiers fell by the thousands, unable to see their enemies, unable to escape. More than 15,000 Romans were slaughtered where they stood. Another 6,000 were captured. The lake turned red with blood. It was the largest ambush in Roman history. Rome was no longer just at war. Rome was losing. With 2 devastating victories, Hannibal had done the unthinkable. He had brought Rome to its knees, but the Republic was not ready to surrender. If Hannibal wanted to break them, he would have to deliver a final crushing blow, and Rome would give him that chance. Rome was in full panic. Never before had their legions suffered such humiliating defeats, back to back. The Republic was shaken to its core. Who was this man? How could he be defeating the mightiest military force in the world? The Senate needed a solution, and they found one in a man named Quintus Fabius Maximus. Fabius knew that fighting Hannibal head-on was suicide. Instead, he adopted a radical strategy: avoid battle entirely. Instead of facing Hannibal in open combat, Fabius shadowed him, following his movements, cutting off his supplies, harassing his foraging parties, and denying him the decisive engagement he wanted. It was a game of patience. Hannibal, now deep in enemy territory, began to feel the strain. His men, exhausted from constant marching and unable to resupply, started to suffer. The psychological toll was immense facing an enemy who refused to fight, but never allowed you to rest. It was the first time since arriving in Italy that Hannibal was slowed down. But then, something changed. The Roman Senate, impatient and frustrated by Fabius's cowardly tactics, removed him from command. They wanted a general who would deliver a decisive victory. They wanted a direct confrontation, and Hannibal was more than willing to oblige. With Fabius out of the picture, Rome gathered its forces for one final all-out confrontation. They assembled the largest army in their history, over 80,000 soldiers, twice the size of Hannibal's army. Their goal? To crush him once and for all. The stage was set for what would become one of the most infamous battles in history. A battle where Hannibal wouldn't just defeat Rome, he would annihilate them. And he would do it using a strategy so brilliant, so devastating, that it would be banned from warfare for centuries to come. The two armies met near the small town of Cannae in the summer of 216 BCE. The Roman commanders, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, were confident. How could they lose? They outnumbered Hannibal nearly 2-1. They had the best equipment, the best soldiers, the full might of the Roman war machine. But they underestimated Hannibal, for he was about to deliver the most perfectly executed military maneuver in history. Hannibal didn't just want to win this battle, he wanted to break Rome's spirit forever. So he let them think they were winning. At first, as the battle began, the Romans surged forward, pushing Hannibal's forces back. They thought they had him on the run. But it was all a trap. Hannibal had intentionally weakened his center, drawing the Roman forces further and further in. Then, at the exact right moment, his cavalry struck from the sides. The Carthaginian infantry closed in from the flanks. The Roman legions were now completely surrounded. What followed was slaughter. More than 50,000 Roman soldiers were cut down in a single day. It was the worst defeat in Rome's history. A disaster so complete that it sent shockwaves through the entire ancient world. Rome had never suffered such humiliation. But how did Hannibal, outnumbered and deep in enemy territory, turn the tide of war? What happened at Cannae was more than just a victory. It was a massacre so complete it left Rome on the brink of collapse. The battlefield at Cannae was still, but only for a moment. Then the deafening blast of Roman war horns shattered the air. 80,000 Roman soldiers, the largest army the Republic had ever assembled, began their advance. Shields locked, swords drawn, their steps thundered across the dry Italian soil. Across the field, Hannibal watched. He had seen this before: Rome's confidence, their belief in sheer numbers, their arrogance in assuming that discipline alone would win them the day. But Hannibal wasn't just here to win. He was here to annihilate Rome's military might forever. The battle began. Rome's infantry clashed with Hannibal's front linea mix of Iberian and Gallic warriors. The Romans pushed forward, their superior numbers forcing Hannibal's center to fall back. It looked like a victory. It was a trap. Hannibal had planned this moment with surgical precision. His center wasn't collapsing, it was drawing the Romans in. The more they advanced, the deeper they fell into his formation, shaped like a crescent moon. Then, at the exact right moment, Hannibal gave the signal. From the flanks, his elite African heavy infantry-hardened veterans, trained in the very tactics the Romans prided themselves on, swung inward like a closing door. The Roman legions were now being attacked from three sides. A general might have still found a way to break free, if not for what happened next. Hannibal's cavalry, led by the brilliant commander Maharbal, had already defeated the Roman horsemen on the edges of the battlefield. Instead of chasing down fleeing riders, they did something unexpected. They wheeled around and charged straight into the Romans from behind. The Roman army, 80,000 men strong, was now completely encircled. The hunters had become the hunted. From the outside, the Carthaginian forces pressed inward, tightening the trap like a slow, grinding machine. The Romans were trapped so tightly that they could barely lift their swords. Then, the slaughter began. For hours, the Romans tried to fight back. They hacked at their enemies, but there was no escape, no room to maneuver, no hope of reinforcement. As the midday sun rose, the heat became unbearable. Men collapsed from exhaustion before a blade could even reach them. Their greatest army symbol of Roman power was being systematically erased. Hannibal had done what no general in history had ever accomplished. He had not just defeated the Roman army. He had trapped them, crushed them, and left their remains scattered in the dust. Rome's worst nightmare had just come true, but the greatest shock was yet to come. By the time the slaughter ended, over 50,000 Roman soldiers lay dead. Thousands more were captured. It was the worst defeat in Roman history. And back in Rome, the news arrived like a death sentence. Back in Rome, chaos erupted. Messengers, covered in dust and blood, delivered the unthinkable news. The Republic had suffered its greatest military disaster. Over 50,000 Roman soldiers were dead. Nearly 6,000 were captured. Among the fallen were senators, nobles, and some of Rome's most experienced commanders. The entire Roman war machine had been dismantled in a single day. It was not just a military defeat, it was a catastrophe. Rome had never faced an enemy like this before. They had fought great wars, crushed countless nations, and expanded their empire across the Mediterranean. But this was something else. For the first time in its history, Rome had no army left to send. And to make matters worse, the road to Rome was open. The Senate went into emergency meetings. The people panicked. Women wept in the streets. Some nobles even began discussing surrender. This was the moment that history would never forget. And yet, Hannibal did not march on Rome. Why? Why? After achieving the greatest military victory of his career, after erasing an entire Roman army, after breaking Rome's spirit, did Hannibal not deliver the final blow? Some say it was caution. Rome was still a mighty city with massive walls, impossible to take without siege weapons. Others argue that Hannibal believed Rome would surrender on its own, breaking under the weight of its greatest defeat. But one thing is certain. His failure to act gave Rome the time it desperately needed. The Senate, shaken but not broken, made a fateful decision. They would not surrender. They would never surrender. Instead, they would do something far more dangerous. They would change the way they fought Hannibal forever. From this moment on, Rome would abandon its pride. They would stop fighting Hannibal head-on. They would avoid direct confrontations. Instead, they would turn Italy into a battlefield of attrition. They would starve his army, cut off his supplies, deny him reinforcements, and turn every town, every road, and every village into a war of endurance. Hannibal had delivered the most devastating defeat in Rome's history. But Rome was about to return the favor. The war was far from over. Hannibal had won the battle. But had he truly won the war? What happened next would decide the fate of the ancient world. For 16 years, Hannibal roamed Italy undefeated. 16 years of battles, of ambushes, of cunning strategies that left Rome humiliated and weakened. He had shattered Rome's greatest armies, humiliated their proudest generals, and turned their lands into his own personal battlefield. Yet, despite everything, despite every victory, he never took Rome itself. How could a man who had won every battle still lose the war? The answer lay in Rome's ability to adapt. At first, Rome had fought Hannibal as they had always fought their enemies with brute force, massive armies, and open battles. And time again, Hannibal had destroyed them. But then, under the leadership of Quintus Fabius Maximus, Rome did something unexpected. They changed the way they fought. Fabius realized that Hannibal thrived in battle, so Rome stopped giving him battles to fight. Instead, they used a tactic that was slow, frustrating, and difficult, but it worked. Rather than facing Hannibal in open combat, they engaged in a war of attrition. Rome's armies shadowed Hannibal's every move, always close enough to pressure him, but never engaging in direct battle. They cut off his supply routes, harassed his foraging parties, and ensured that his army was always on the move, always struggling to find food and shelter. Hannibal had spent years destroying Roman armies. Now Rome was doing the same to him without ever having to fight. Hannibal's greatest weakness. Hannibal had been in Italy for nearly 2 decades. His army was still powerful, still deadly, but it was shrinking. The problem wasn't the Romans. The problem was Carthage. Despite all of Hannibal's success, despite the fact that he had brought Rome to its knees, Carthage refused to send him proper reinforcements. His homeland, the city he was fighting for, had abandoned him. The Carthaginian government, controlled by corrupt politicians and greedy merchants, did not see the war as Hannibal did. They feared that sending more troops to Italy would leave Carthage vulnerable. Instead of providing him with full reinforcements, they sent small, scattered forces, never enough to tip the balance. Hannibal, for the first time since arriving in Italy, realized he was alone. And Rome? Rome was getting stronger. By 204 BCE, Rome had rebuilt its armies. Their economy was recovering. Their generals had studied Hannibal's tactics and learned how to counter them. And then, Rome made its boldest move yet. They decided to take the war to Carthage itself. Hannibal had spent his entire career fighting in Italy. Now, for the first time, his homeland was under threat. The hunter was about to become the hunted. While Hannibal was trapped in Italy, fighting a war he could no longer win, Rome was preparing to strike at the very heart of his homeland. And the man leading that charge was unlike any general Rome had ever seen. In 204 BCE, a young Roman general named Scipio Africanus did what no Roman before him had dared to do. He ignored the war in Italy. He ignored Hannibal's presence. Instead, he set sail for North Africa. His goal? To force Carthage into a final, decisive battle. Scipio was no ordinary commander. He had studied Hannibal's tactics for years. He had learned from every mistake Rome had made. He was young, brilliant, and bold, willing to take risks that other Roman generals never would. His strategy was simple but devastating. If he could invade Carthage itself, the Carthaginian government would have no choice but to recall Hannibal from Italy. And it worked. The moment Roman forces landed in North Africa, Carthage panicked. The politicians, the merchants, the same men who had denied Hannibal reinforcements for years, suddenly realized their mistake. They begged him to return. For the first time in over a decade, Hannibal set foot on Carthaginian soil. But he did not return as a conqueror. He returned as a man forced to defend the very city that had betrayed him. The war was coming to an end. The two greatest generals of their time, Hannibal and Scipio, met for the first time face to face before the battle. According to legend, Hannibal, now in his mid-40s, looked at the young Roman commander and saw himself. He saw the same confidence, the same intelligence, the same hunger for victory. Hannibal, knowing the odds were against him, offered peace. Scipio refused. Rome wanted total victory. And so, on the plains of Zama, the final battle of the Second Punic War began. Hannibal had war elephants, terrifying beasts that had once crushed Roman soldiers like insects. But Scipio had trained his men to counter them. As the elephants charged, the Romans opened their ranks, allowing the massive creatures to pass harmlessly through before cutting them down from behind. Hannibal's cavalry was weak, made up of unreliable mercenaries. Scipio's cavalry, meanwhile, was disciplined, trained, and experienced. The two armies clashed. Hannibal fought like a lion. His men held the line for hours. But Scipio anticipated every move. He mirrored Hannibal's own tactics. The double envelopment maneuver that Hannibal had used at Cannae turned it against him. The Carthaginian army collapsed. The invincible Hannibal, the man who had terrorized Rome for 2 decades, had finally been defeated. Carthage surrendered. The Second Punic War was over. Hannibal fled Carthage, but his war was over. Rome spared his life, but they never forgot him. They hunted him for years, tracking him across the Mediterranean. For a while, he served foreign kings, always a soldier, always a strategist. But Rome's shadow loomed over him. In the end, Hannibal refused to be captured. Cornered in Bithynia, he took poison, ending his own life rather than falling into Roman hands. His final words were bitter, filled with defiance. "Let us relieve the Romans of their fear of an old man." Even in death, Hannibal remained Rome's greatest nightmare. Hannibal Barca lost the war, but he changed the world. His tactics, the double envelopment at Cannae, his use of terrain and deception, his psychological warfare are still studied in military academies today. His name stands alongside Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Napoleon as one of history's greatest military minds. And his strategy? The same maneuver he used to annihilate Rome at Cannae was considered so deadly, so perfect, that for centuries no army dared to use it again. A strategy so genius, it was banned from warfare. But what if Hannibal had marched on Rome after Cannae? What if Carthage had sent reinforcements? Would history have changed forever? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Rome had won. The mighty Carthaginian war machine had been dismantled, its armies defeated, its once powerful fleets reduced to ashes. The city of Carthage, though still standing, was now nothing more than a vassal state under Roman control. The Second Punic War, the greatest war of its time, was finally over. But though Rome had conquered Carthage, they had not erased Hannibal Barca. The man who had terrified Rome, who had outwitted their finest generals, and who had humiliated their legions in battle after battle, he was still alive. And as long as he lived, he remained Rome's greatest nightmare. Hannibal, now in his mid-40s, returned to Carthage as a man without an army, without power, and without a future. He had spent nearly 2 decades fighting for his homeland, only to see it betray him. Carthage, under Roman rule, had been forced into a humiliating peace. They were stripped of their ability to wage war. Their navy was burned to the ground. Their economy was strangled by crushing war debts that would take decades to pay off. And worst of all, they had no control over their own fate. Hannibal, despite his losses, still had one goal left: to rebuild Carthage and restore its power. He was no longer a general, but he was still a brilliant strategist. He turned his mind toward politics, working to restructure Carthage's finances, strengthen its economy, and free it from Rome's grip. But Rome had other plans. To them, Hannibal was still too dangerous. Even without an army, even without power, the idea of Hannibal was enough to strike fear into the Roman Senate. They believed that as long as he lived, Carthage would never truly be under their control. And so, they demanded his exile. The Carthaginian elite, the same men who had refused to send him reinforcements when he needed them most, now turned against him completely. They agreed to Rome's demand. Hannibal had spent his entire life fighting Rome. Now, he was forced to run from them. With no other choice, he fled his homeland, a warrior without a country, a general without an army. But even in exile, he refused to give up. For years, he traveled across the Mediterranean, seeking allies, searching for a new army, trying to find one last way to strike back at Rome. He served as a military advisor to foreign kings. He helped train armies in the East. He even plotted to create a new alliance of nations against Rome. But everywhere he went, Rome followed. The Roman Senate, obsessed with destroying him, pressured every ruler, every city, every kingdom that harbored him. Again and again, his allies abandoned him. And slowly, Hannibal realized the truth. Rome didn't just want him dead. They wanted him erased from history. They wanted his name to fade into obscurity. But Hannibal had one last move left to play. With Rome closing in, Hannibal knew that his time was running out, but he refused to let them have the satisfaction of taking him alive. His final act would be one of defiance. It was 183 BCE when Rome finally caught up to him. After years of pursuit, years of hunting him across the Mediterranean, they found him in Bithynia, a kingdom in modern-day Turkey. Roman envoys arrived, demanding his surrender. There would be no trial, no mercy, no honorable exile. If he was taken, he would be paraded through the streets of Rome in chains, humiliated before the people he had once terrified, and executed as a spectacle for all to see. Hannibal refused. Instead, he chose death on his own terms. According to legend, as the Roman soldiers closed in, he calmly took a vial of poison, one he had kept with him for years, always knowing that this moment would come. As he swallowed it, he spoke his final words. "Let us relieve the Romans of their fear of an old man." Hannibal Barca was dead. And yet, Rome's obsession with him did not end. Even in death, he haunted them. For centuries, Roman parents would whisper his name to frighten their children. Hannibal ad portas. Hannibal is at the gates. Even when he was gone, Rome feared him, because deep down, they knew the truth. They had won the war. But Hannibal had won something far greater. He had won immortality. His name would live on long after Rome itself had crumbled. Hannibal was not just a warrior. He was a visionary, a man who redefined the art of war. His strategies were so advanced, so devastating, that they are still studied in military academies today. Napoleon Bonaparte admired Hannibal's ability to move armies with speed and deception. General George S. Patton studied his tactics in World War II, learning how to use enemy psychology against them. The U.S. Military Academy at West Point still teaches his campaigns as examples of perfect battlefield strategy. But perhaps the greatest proof of Hannibal's genius? The very maneuver that won him the Battle of Canatha double envelopment tactic was considered so effective, so perfect, that it was avoided for centuries. It was too deadly, too unstoppable, too perfect. A strategy so genius, it was practically banned from warfare. And yet, even after Hannibal's death, Rome still feared his legacy. They feared that one day another Hannibal would rise. And so, 50 years later, they ensured that could never happen. In 146 BCE, during the Third Punic War, Rome launched a final assault on Carthage. For 3 years, Carthage resisted. But when the Romans finally broke through, they did something unthinkable. They didn't just conquer the city. They erased it. Over 100,000 Carthaginians were slaughtered. The survivors were sold into slavery. The city was burned to the ground. And, according to legend, the Romans salted the earth so that nothing would ever grow there again. Carthage had been wiped off the map. But they could never erase Hannibal. Hannibal had fought a war that he was never meant to win. Carthage had failed him. Rome had outlasted him. History had declared him the loser. And yet, he was the man that Rome never forgot. Because while Rome still stands, the name Hannibal Barca is spoken across the world. He was more than just a general. He was a force of nature. A mind so brilliant that it shaped the future of warfare. A warrior so feared that even his enemies respected him. A legend so great that, over 2,000 years later, his story is still being told. But what if Hannibal had marched on Rome after Cannae? What if Carthage had sent reinforcements? Would history have changed forever? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. The story of Hannibal Barca is one of brilliance, betrayal, and ultimate defeat, but not the kind of defeat that erases a man from history. Because while Rome won the war, Hannibal won something greater. He won immortality. More than 2,000 years later, his name still echoes in military academies, history books, and the minds of those who study the art of war. His strategies changed the course of military history. His tactics were so perfect that they were feared, studied, and in some ways, forbidden. But it leaves us with an important question. What if history had gone differently? What if Hannibal had marched on Rome after Cannae? What if Carthage had supported him instead of betraying him? Would we be speaking of a world where Rome never became the dominant empire of the West? Would Hannibal have rewritten the fate of the ancient world? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you think this story was incredible, wait until you hear about another legendary military mind. Because if you thought Hannibal's strategies were brilliant, wait until you hear how Genghis Khan built the greatest empire the world has ever seen. Click here to watch.